The Kroot emerged on the world of Pech, a verdant planet located in the Ultima Segmentum, far from the cradle of humanity and the great powers that would eventually dominate the galaxy. Pech itself is a world of dense forests, sprawling jungles, and vast plains where predator and prey exist in constant evolutionary flux. The planet's ecosystem fostered an environment where adaptation meant survival and stagnation meant extinction. It was within this crucible of natural selection that the Kroot species first arose, descended from avian ancestors that once soared through Pech's canopies before descending to become terrestrial hunters. The earliest Kroot bore little resemblance to the sophisticated mercenary warriors known throughout the galaxy today. Their avian heritage remained evident in their physiology, the distinctive beaked maw, the quills that would later develop into more complex forms, and the hollow bone structure that made them lighter and more agile than many other sentient species. These primitive Kroot lived as pack hunters, their bodies already displaying the remarkable flexibility that would become their defining characteristic. Where other species followed rigid evolutionary paths determined by environmental pressures and random mutation over countless generations, the Kroot possessed something far more extraordinary, a hyperadaptive physiology that responded directly to their consumption of other organisms. This evolutionary consumption ability set the Kroot apart from virtually every other known species in the galaxy. Their genetic structure functions as a biological repository, capable of analyzing, absorbing, and incorporating beneficial DNA sequences from consumed prey directly into their own genome. This process operates across generations rather than within individual lifespans, though the effects manifest with remarkable speed compared to conventional evolution. When Kroot consume the flesh of other creatures, specialized organs within their digestive system break down the genetic material and identify advantageous traits. These traits are then encoded into the Kroot genetic line, appearing in subsequent generations with increasing frequency and refinement. The mechanism behind this ability remains poorly understood even by the Adeptus Mechanicus biologists, who have studied captured Kroot specimens with intense scrutiny. What is clear is that the Kroot possess a form of directed evolution, allowing their species to adapt to new environments, threats, and opportunities far more rapidly than natural selection would permit. A kindred that regularly consumes swift, agile prey will produce offspring that display enhanced speed and reflexes. Those that feed primarily on heavily muscled creatures will spawn stronger, more robust descendants. The process extends beyond mere physical attributes. Consuming the flesh of psychically active species can awaken latent mental abilities, while feeding on technologically advanced beings can enhance problem-solving capabilities and tool use. This remarkable trait came with inherent dangers that the ancient Kroot learned through bitter experience. Indiscriminate consumption could lead to devolution rather than advancement. Kindreds that fed too heavily on primitive or bestial creatures found their descendants regressing, losing intelligence and sophistication to become little more than animals themselves. The Kroot learned to be selective, to choose their meals with care and intention, understanding that they were not simply feeding their bodies, but shaping the future of their bloodlines. This knowledge became central to Kroot culture and gave rise to the most important caste within their society, the Shapers. Before the Kroot encountered other spacefaring species, their civilization on Pech had already developed a complex tribal structure centered around kindreds, extended family groups that hunted, fought, and evolved together. Each kindred maintained its own territory, its own traditions, and its own evolutionary path shaped by the prey available in their region and the choices made by their leaders. Competition between kindreds was fierce, but rarely resulted in total annihilation. The Kroot understood instinctively that diversity within their species represented strength, that different evolutionary paths might prove valuable under different circumstances. The Shapers emerged as the guiding force behind Kroot development, individuals who possessed an innate understanding of the evolutionary consumption process that went beyond instinct into something approaching science. A Shaper could examine prey and determine what traits its consumption might confer. They could guide their kindred's diet with precision, steering their evolutionary development towards specific goals over multiple generations. A shaper might decide that their kindred required greater strength to hunt the massive beasts of Pech's southern continent, or enhanced sensory capabilities to track prey through the dense fog-shrouded forests of the northern reaches. Through careful selection of prey and strict dietary protocols, they would shape their kindred accordingly. The role of shaper carried immense responsibility and equally immense authority. They were simultaneously spiritual leaders, genetic engineers, and military commanders. Their decisions affected not just the current generation, but all descendants to come. Shapers developed their own traditions and knowledge base, passing information from master to apprentice about which creatures conferred which traits, which combinations proved synergistic, and which led to degeneration. This accumulated wisdom became the foundation of Kroot civilization, more valuable than any technology or weapon. Shamanistic traditions permeated early Kroot culture, intertwining with their evolutionary practices in ways that outside observers often found difficult to distinguish. The Kroot recognized that they were not separate from the natural world, but part of its endless cycle of consumption and transformation. They honored the prey that gave them strength, performing rituals before and after hunts that acknowledged the transfer of essence from consumed to consumer. These practices were not mere superstition. They reflected a genuine understanding that the Kroot were engaging in something profound each time they fed, something that transcended simple nutrition. The Kroot's tribal existence might have continued indefinitely, their species slowly spreading across Pech through countless small evolutionary branches, had they not discovered the warspheres. These ancient technological artifacts represented a mystery that even the Kroot themselves cannot fully explain. The prevailing theory among Kroot oral tradition holds that an ancient, technologically advanced Kroot civilization existed in the distant past, one that had already mastered space travel and sophisticated engineering before some catastrophe reduced their descendants to the tribal hunters that would eventually rediscover these relics. The warspheres are massive constructs, part spacecraft and part mobile habitat, capable of housing entire kindreds and sustaining them through the void of space. Their technology operates on principles that the Kroot understand through practice rather than theory. They know how to pilot the warspheres, how to maintain their basic systems, and how to use their weapons, but the underlying mechanisms remain opaque. Each warsphere is unique, its systems having evolved through centuries of repairs, modifications, and adaptations performed by generations of Kroot who worked more through intuition and trial and error than systematic engineering. The discovery of the first warspheres transformed Kroot civilization. Kindreds that gained access to these vessels found themselves no longer bound to Pech, able to travel to other worlds and hunt prey that their planet-bound cousins could never imagine. This expansion brought the Kroot into contact with other species, some of which became prey, others allies, and still others threats that required new evolutionary adaptations to combat effectively. The warspheres became central to Kroot identity, serving as mobile homes, fortresses, and symbols of their reach across the stars. Each warsphere typically houses a single kindred or coalition of related kindreds, becoming a self-contained ecosystem where the inhabitants maintain their traditions while adapting to life in the void. The vessel's interiors are often modified to resemble Pech's natural environments, with carefully cultivated vegetation and even transplanted fauna that serve both as reminders of home and as controlled food sources for specific evolutionary purposes. Shapers aboard warspheres face unique challenges, needing to guide their kindred's development while working with limited prey diversity and the constraints of shipboard life. The Kroot's expansion from Pech was neither rapid nor organized in any centralized fashion. Individual warspheres departed when their kindreds felt ready, venturing into the galaxy to find new hunting grounds and opportunities. Some traveled for generations before finding suitable worlds to settle. Others hired themselves as mercenaries to alien species, trading their martial prowess for payment, and more importantly, for opportunities to consume new and interesting prey. This mercenary tradition would eventually bring the Kroot into contact with the Tau Empire, a relationship that would prove transformative for both species. The Kroot that spread across the galaxy carried with them the traditions and knowledge accumulated on Pech, but they also began to diverge. Kindreds that settled different worlds, consumed different prey, and faced different challenges began to evolve along distinct paths. Some became larger and more physically powerful, others faster and more cunning. Certain kindreds developed specialized adaptations for specific environments or combat roles. Despite this divergence, all Kroot maintained their core identity and their reverence for the shapers who guided their evolutionary journey. The Kroot's first encounter with the Tau Empire occurred during the Second Sphere expansion, when the young empire pushed outward from its core worlds in the Ultima Segmentum, seeking to spread the philosophy of the greater good across new territories. The Tau had already absorbed several alien species into their empire as auxiliary forces, but they had yet to encounter a species quite like the Kroot. The initial contact was far from the cooperative relationship that would eventually develop. Tau exploration fleets venturing into regions near Pech encountered Kroot warspheres operating as mercenary bands, and the early interactions were marked by suspicion and occasional violence. The Tau viewed the Kroot through the lens of their own philosophy, seeing a primitive species that consumed the flesh of sentient beings, a practice that many Tau found disturbing despite their pragmatic approach to incorporating alien auxiliaries. The Kroot, for their part, regarded the Tau as another potential employer, or in some cases, as interesting prey whose consumption might confer technological aptitude to future generations. Several skirmishes occurred when Tau survey teams encountered Kroot hunting parties on contested worlds, each side testing the other's capabilities. The Tau quickly learned that despite their apparent primitiveness, the Kroot were formidable warriors whose speed, ferocity, and adaptability made them dangerous opponents. These early conflicts revealed much about both species. Tau fire warriors found that their doctrine of coordinated fire support and defensive positioning worked well against Kroot charges, but only if they maintained discipline and proper spacing. Kroot who broke through Tau firing lines inflicted devastating casualties in close combat, their rifles equipped with vicious blades proving equally effective as both ranged and melee weapons. The Tau's battlesuits provided effective counters to Kroot infantry, but Kroot Hounds, evolutionary offshoots of the main species bred specifically for hunting, could track and harass isolated Tau units with unnerving efficiency. Neither side could claim clear superiority, and both recognized that the other possessed qualities that commanded respect. The relationship between the Kroot and Tau might have remained one of occasional conflict and wary neutrality had it not been for events on Pech itself. The Kroot homeworld, despite being the ancestral origin of the species, was not immune to the threats that plagued the galaxy. An orc invasion force, substantial enough to threaten multiple Kroot kindreds, descended upon Pech during the height of the Second Sphere expansion. The orcs, drawn by the prospect of good fighting and the lush environment suitable for their fungal ecology, established a significant foothold on the planet's surface. Kroot kindreds mobilized to defend their territories, but the orcs' numbers and their ability to rapidly reproduce through spore propagation meant that conventional Kroot tactics of ambush and selective engagement were proving insufficient. The Tau Empire, having established diplomatic contact with several Kroot kindreds through their expansion efforts, received word of the orc invasion. The water caste diplomats recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the benefits of the greater good, while simultaneously eliminating a potential orc threat that could spread to nearby Tau colonies. A Tau expeditionary force was dispatched to Pech, arriving to find the Kroot locked in fierce combat across multiple fronts. The Tau forces, equipped with advanced technology and coordinated military doctrine, represented exactly the kind of support the Kroot needed to turn the tide. The pivotal moment in Kroot-Tau relations came when Anchor Proc, a shaper of considerable influence whose kindred controlled significant territories on Pech, made the decision to formally ally with the Tau forces against the orc invaders. This was not a simple battlefield alliance of convenience, but a calculated strategic choice that would reshape the future of his species. Anchor Proc recognized that the Tau possessed capabilities that complemented Kroot's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. The Tau's advanced orbital assets, artillery support, and logistical capabilities could provide Kroot warriors with advantages they had never before possessed. More importantly, The Tau's access to void-capable transportation could allow Kroot Kindreds to reach battlefields across the galaxy far more efficiently than their limited number of ancient warspheres permitted. The combined Kroot and Tau campaign against the orcs on Pech demonstrated the potential of their cooperation. Kroot warriors, guided by their shaper's intimate knowledge of Pech's terrain, conducted devastating ambushes and infiltration operations that disrupted orc supply lines and isolated enemy formations. Tau Firecast forces provided the heavy firepower and coordinated fire support necessary to break orc concentrations when they attempted to mass for their characteristic brutal assaults. Tau Hammerhead gunships in crisis battlesuits eliminated orc vehicles and heavy weapons that would have required enormous Kroot casualties to overcome through direct assault. Meanwhile, Kroot consumed fallen orcs with systematic purpose, their shapers carefully monitoring the intake to ensure that useful orcoid traits, enhanced musculature, regenerative capabilities, and innate aggression when needed, could be incorporated without the devolutionary risks of excessive orc consumption. The campaign lasted several months, with both sides learning to coordinate their efforts with increasing sophistication. Tau commanders came to appreciate the Kroot's ability to operate independently for extended periods without resupply, their skill at close-quarters combat, and their uncanny ability to predict enemy movements through a combination of tracking skills and what the Tau could only describe as predatory instinct. The Kroot, in turn, witnessed the effectiveness of Tau technology and military organization, seeing how coordinated fire discipline and advanced equipment could multiply combat effectiveness. Anchor Proc and other influential shapers recognized that permanent alliance with the Tau could provide their species with opportunities for evolution and combat experience far beyond what isolated mercenary work could offer. When the orc presence on Pech was finally eliminated, the foundation for lasting cooperation had been established through shared combat and mutual respect earned in battle. The Tau Water Caste, working with Fire Caste commanders who had fought alongside the Kroot, negotiated the terms that would integrate the Kroot into the Tau Empire's military structure. These negotiations were complex, as they needed to accommodate both Tau expectations of loyalty and coordination while respecting Kroot traditions and their fierce independence. The resulting arrangement represented a unique relationship within the Tau Empire, different from the integration of other auxiliary species. The Kroot were not incorporated as full members of the Tau Empire in the way that the Tau themselves belonged to it. They did not adopt the Tau caste system, nor did they fully embrace the philosophy of the greater good as the Tau understood it. Instead, the Kroot maintained their tribal structure, their shaper-led kindreds, and their traditional practices including evolutionary consumption. What they agreed to was service as auxiliary forces within Tau military operations, providing specialized infantry and close combat capabilities that complemented Tau doctrine. In exchange, the Tau would provide transportation aboard their vessels, access to battlefields across the expanding empire, and payment in the form of technology, equipment, and most importantly, opportunities to consume diverse prey. This arrangement suited both parties remarkably well. The Tau gained access to fierce auxiliary forces who excelled in roles that Tau doctrine handled less effectively. Kroot warriors could secure objectives in dense terrain where battlesuits struggled to maneuver, could conduct reconnaissance and infiltration operations with minimal support, and could engage enemy forces in close combat without requiring the extensive training that Tau fire warriors needed to function effectively at short range. The Kroot's adaptability meant they could operate in environments that would require significant Tau technological support, and their ability to live off the land, or more accurately, off the enemy, reduced logistical burdens. For the Kroot, the benefits were equally substantial. Service with the Tau provided regular access to battlefields across the galaxy, exposing them to prey species they would never encounter through independent mercenary work. Each campaign offered opportunities for evolutionary advancement as Kroot consumed fallen enemies, carefully selecting traits under shaper guidance to enhance their capabilities. The Tau's advanced transportation network meant that Kroot kindreds could deploy to distant war zones without relying solely on their limited warspheres, allowing more kindreds to participate in off-world operations. Tau technology, while not fully adopted, provided useful equipment that enhanced Kroot effectiveness without compromising their traditional combat methods. The Tau provided Kroot auxiliaries with equipment that complemented rather than replaced their traditional gear. Kroot rifles remained their primary weapon, but Tau targeting systems and improved power sources enhanced their effectiveness. Tau manufactured blades and equipment were offered, though many Kroot preferred their traditional weapons, which had been shaped through generations of use and held cultural significance. The Tau did not attempt to fundamentally alter Kroot society or combat doctrine, recognizing that the Kroot's effectiveness stemmed from their unique capabilities rather than from conformity to Tau methods. The integration process was not without complications. Tau forces sometimes struggled to coordinate with Kroot auxiliaries, whose tactical decisions seemed incomprehensible to commanders trained in Tau military academies. Kroot would sometimes abandon assigned positions to pursue prey, or would refuse to advance when their shapers determined that the consumption opportunities did not justify the risk. Tau personnel, particularly those from the Earth caste and Water caste, found Kroot feeding practices disturbing despite intellectual understanding of their evolutionary purpose. Some Kroot kindreds maintained mercenary contracts with other employers even while nominally serving the Tau, creating occasional diplomatic complications when their services brought them into conflict with Tau interests. Despite these challenges, the alliance flourished because both species approached it pragmatically rather than ideologically. The Tau accepted that the Kroot would never fully embrace the greater good as they understood it, but recognized that mutual benefit created reliable cooperation. The Kroot understood that service to the Tau required certain compromises and restrictions on their independence, but judged that the opportunities provided outweighed these limitations. Angkor Prok's decision to ally with the Tau on Pech established a template that other influential shapers followed, bringing their kindreds into Tau's service while maintaining their essential Kroot identity. The relationship evolved as both species learned from experience. Tau commanders developed better understanding of how to employ Kroot forces effectively, learning to work with shaper decisions rather than against them. Kroot kindreds serving with the Tau adapted their tactics to better coordinate with fire caste operations, understanding that effective cooperation increased their survival and provided better access to valuable prey. Some kindreds developed specialized roles within Tau military operations, becoming expert scouts, infiltrators, or shock troops whose reputations spread throughout the Empire. The Kroot body represents a remarkable fusion of avian ancestry and directed evolutionary adaptation, a living testament to their species' unique biological capabilities. Standing between 6 and 7 feet tall when fully upright, though they often adopt a forward-leaning posture that reduces their apparent height, Kroot possess a distinctive silhouette that immediately identifies them even at distance. Their skeletal structure retains clear markers of their avian origins, with hollow bones that reduce overall body mass while maintaining surprising strength through internal strutting, similar to flight-capable birds. This lightweight frame contributes to their exceptional agility and allows them to move with a speed that catches many opponents off guard, particularly those who mistake their rangy build for weakness. The Kroot skull is perhaps their most immediately recognizable feature, dominated by a powerful beaked jaw that extends forward from the face in a structure that serves multiple purposes. The beak itself is composed of dense keratin over a bone core, capable of delivering crushing bites that can crack armor plating or shear through flesh with equal efficiency. The jaw muscles that power this beak attach to pronounced cranial ridges, giving the Kroot head its characteristic angular profile. Unlike purely avian beaks, the Kroot jaw retains some flexibility, with the lower mandible capable of limited lateral movement that aids in tearing and consuming flesh. The beak's interior contains rows of small, sharp teeth that further assist in processing food, though the Kroot's specialized digestive system does much of the actual work of breaking down consumed matter. Kroot eyes sit in forward-facing sockets that provide excellent binocular vision essential for their predatory nature. The eyes themselves are large and possess excellent low-light capability, allowing Kroot to hunt effectively during Pech's long twilight periods and in the shadowed depths of its forests. Their visual acuity exceeds human baseline, particularly in detecting movement and distinguishing subtle variations in color that help identify prey at distance. The eyes lack pronounced pupils in the human sense, instead featuring a darker central region that expands or contracts based on light conditions. This gives Kroot a somewhat unsettling appearance to many other species, as their gaze seems simultaneously focused and alien. Quills emerge from various points across the Kroot body, most prominently from the head, shoulders, and along the spine. These structures serve as sophisticated sensory organs rather than mere decoration or vestigial features. Each quill contains nerve clusters that detect subtle changes in air pressure, temperature, and vibration, providing the Kroot with environmental awareness that supplements their already acute conventional senses. A Kroot can sense approaching threats through air displacement, detect temperature variations that indicate nearby life forms, and even gauge wind direction and strength through quill stimulation. Shapers possess particularly elaborate quill arrangements, often with more numerous and longer quills that denote their status, while providing enhanced sensory capabilities that aid in their role as evolutionary guides. The Kroot torso is lean and muscular, with a forward-leaning posture that shifts their center of gravity and allows for rapid acceleration when charging or pursuing prey. Their chest cavity houses lungs that operate with exceptional efficiency, processing oxygen through a system of air sacs that ensures continuous gas exchange even during extreme exertion. This respiratory system, another inheritance from their avian ancestors, allows Kroot to maintain peak physical performance for extended periods without the fatigue that would cripple species with less efficient oxygen processing. The digestive system occupies a significant portion of the torso, featuring specialized organs that perform the remarkable feat of genetic analysis and absorption that defines Kroot evolution. Kroot arms are long and well-muscled, ending in hands that possess 4 digits including an opposable thumb. The fingers are tipped with sturdy claws that serve as both weapons and climbing aids, capable of finding purchase on surfaces that would defeat species with flat nails. These claws can be retracted partially into protective sheaths, preventing damage during equipment handling, while remaining ready for immediate deployment in combat. Kroot hands possess excellent dexterity despite their clawed nature, allowing them to manipulate their rifles and other equipment with precision. The arms themselves can deliver powerful strikes, and many Kroot fighting styles incorporate sweeping arm movements that use reach advantage to keep opponents at bay or set up devastating beak strikes. The legs represent perhaps the most obviously avian aspect of Kroot anatomy, configured in a digitigrade arrangement where the Kroot walks on their toes with the ankle elevated. This configuration provides exceptional running speed and jumping capability, with powerful leg muscles capable of propelling a Kroot into rapid sprints that can overtake most humanoid species. The elevated ankle joint acts as an additional lever, increasing stride length and allowing for sudden changes in direction that make Kroot difficult targets in open combat. The feet themselves possess 3 forward-facing toes and a smaller rear-facing toe, all equipped with the same sturdy claws found on the hands. This arrangement provides excellent grip on varied terrain, allowing Kroot to scale trees, navigate rocky surfaces, and maintain footing on unstable ground with equal facility. The biological mechanism underlying Kroot hyperadaptation operates through a process that remains only partially understood even by those tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus who have studied captured specimens. When a Kroot consumes flesh, the material passes through their standard digestive tract, where it is broken down mechanically and chemically. However, a specialized organ cluster located in the lower digestive system performs functions far beyond simple nutrient extraction. These organs, which imperial biologists have designated the genetic absorption complex, for lack of a better term, contain specialized cells that can identify and isolate DNA sequences from consumed tissue. The process appears to involve both chemical analysis and some form of biological pattern recognition, that can distinguish beneficial genetic traits from neutral or harmful ones. Once identified, these genetic sequences are not immediately incorporated into the consuming Kroot's own genome. Instead, they are stored in what appears to be a form of biological library within specialized cells that maintain the genetic information in a stable state. This information is then transferred to reproductive cells, where it becomes available for incorporation into offspring. The mechanism by which beneficial traits are selected for inclusion in the next generation involves complex biochemical processes that respond to environmental factors, the quantity of specific genetic material consumed, and what can only be described as some form of biological prioritization system. A kindred that repeatedly consumes prey with enhanced musculature will accumulate sufficient genetic material related to muscle development that it becomes prioritized for incorporation into the next generation. This is where shaper guidance becomes absolutely critical to Kroot evolution. Without direction, the genetic absorption process could incorporate traits randomly or based purely on the quantity of material consumed, potentially leading to contradictory adaptations or evolutionary dead ends. Shapers possess an intuitive understanding of how different prey will affect their kindred's development, knowledge accumulated through generations of observation and passed from master to apprentice. A shaper examines potential prey not just for immediate nutritional value, but for the evolutionary trajectory its consumption will create. They consider the kindred's current adaptations, the challenges they face, and the goals they pursue across multiple generations. Based on this analysis, shapers direct their kindred to consume specific prey in controlled quantities while avoiding others entirely. The practical application of this directed evolution produces results that can seem almost miraculous to outside observers. A kindred operating in dense jungle environments might be directed to consume arboreal species, producing offspring with enhanced climbing capabilities, improved grip strength, and better depth perception for navigating three-dimensional terrain. Another kindred facing heavily armored opponents might consume prey with thick hides or natural armor plating, leading to descendants with tougher skin and denser bone structure. The process operates across generations rather than within individual lifetimes, but the speed of change remains remarkable compared to natural evolutionary processes. A focused dietary program maintained across 3 to 4 generations can produce noticeable physical changes in a kindred's population. The Kroot Hounds represent one of the most dramatic examples of directed evolution, though in this case the direction led downward rather than toward increased sophistication. These creatures are devolved Kroot, members of kindreds who were fed exclusively on bestial prey over many generations, until their descendants lost the intelligence and sophistication that characterizes the main species. Kroot Hounds stand roughly 4 feet tall at the shoulder when on all fours, their posture having shifted to quadrupedal locomotion as their cognitive abilities diminished. They retain the distinctive beaked jaws and quilled bodies of their ancestors, but their cranial capacity has reduced significantly, and their behavior operates purely on instinct rather than reason. Despite their devolved state, Kroot Hounds serve valuable purposes within Kroot society, and particularly in military operations. Their enhanced olfactory capabilities allow them to track prey across vast distances, following scent trails that would be imperceptible to their more evolved cousins. In combat, hounds are released in packs to harry enemy formations, their speed and viciousness making them dangerous to isolated soldiers, while their expendable nature means kindreds can deploy them without risking valuable warriors. Shapers maintain careful control over hound populations, ensuring they breed true to their current state rather than continuing to devolve further. The existence of Kroot Hounds serves as a constant reminder to all kindreds of the dangers inherent in uncontrolled or poorly directed consumption. Krootox represent evolution in the opposite direction, the result of Kroot consuming massive herbivores native to Pech and other worlds. These creatures stand nearly twice the height of standard Kroot and possess bulk that dwarfs their cousins, with thick hides and immense physical strength. The evolutionary path that produces Krootox involves sustained consumption of large grazing animals over multiple generations, with shapers carefully managing the diet to enhance size and strength while attempting to maintain sufficient intelligence for the creatures to follow basic commands. The results are only partially successful in this regard. Krootox possess limited cognitive capability, enough to understand simple directions from their handlers, but lacking the reasoning ability of standard Kroot. They serve as living pack animals and mobile weapons platforms, with Kroot often mounting heavy weapons on harnesses attached to their backs. In close combat, a Krootox can trample enemies or deliver devastating strikes with their powerful limbs. Great Narloks occupy a different category entirely, as they are not evolved Kroot, but rather native Pech fauna that kindreds have domesticated and bred for specific purposes. These large reptilian creatures stand between 12 and 15 feet tall, with thick-scaled hides and powerful legs that allow them to carry Kroot riders into battle. Their natural aggression and territorial instincts make them dangerous mounts that require experienced handlers, but properly trained Narloks serve as effective cavalry analogs in Kroot warfare. The relationship between Kroot and Narloks demonstrates the species' broader approach to their environment, recognizing that not all useful creatures need to be consumed and incorporated. Sometimes conventional domestication and breeding produces better results than attempting to evolve Kroot into forms suitable for specific roles. The dangers of consumption extend far beyond the risk of devolution represented by Kroot Hounds. Overspecialization represents a constant threat that shapers must guard against vigilantly. A kindred that adapts too heavily toward a specific environment or combat role may find itself unable to function effectively when circumstances change. Excessive consumption of aquatic species might produce Kroot with enhanced swimming capabilities, but reduced effectiveness on land. Too much focus on prey with enhanced sensory capabilities could lead to descendants with hypersensitive organs that become liabilities in certain environments. Shapers must balance specialization against versatility, ensuring their kindreds remain adaptable even as they pursue specific evolutionary goals. Certain types of flesh are absolutely forbidden to Kroot consumption, with prohibitions enforced through both shaper authority and deep cultural taboo. Chaos-tainted flesh represents the most absolute of these prohibitions. The corruption that permeates servants of the ruinous powers does not simply affect their physical bodies, but fundamentally warps them at a level that makes consumption catastrophically dangerous. Kroot who feed on chaos-tainted prey risk not just physical mutation, but spiritual corruption that can spread through entire kindreds. The few documented cases of kindreds that violated this taboo resulted in populations that devolved into twisted abominations, their hyperadaptive biology incorporating demonic traits that destroyed their sanity and cohesion. Shapers teach the prohibition against chaos-tainted flesh from the earliest age, and kindreds that encounter chaos forces are instructed to burn enemy dead rather than risk even accidental consumption. The legendary lost kindreds serve as cautionary tales told by shapers to illustrate the consequences of unwise consumption. These stories, passed down through generations, describe kindreds that pursued evolutionary paths that led to their destruction or transformation into something no longer recognizably Kroot. One tale speaks of a kindred that consumed exclusively psychic prey, seeking to develop powerful mental abilities. The resulting descendants supposedly gained the desired psychic powers, but lost their resistance to warp predation, eventually being consumed by entities from the immaterium. Another story describes a kindred that fed on highly aggressive predators for so many generations that their descendants became uncontrollable berserkers, turning on each other in fits of rage until the kindred destroyed itself. Whether these tales represent historical fact or cautionary fiction matters less than their function in Kroot society, reinforcing the wisdom of measured, shaper-guided evolution over reckless experimentation. The fundamental organizational unit of Kroot society is the kindred, an extended family group that functions simultaneously as clan, military unit, and evolutionary cohort. A typical kindred consists of anywhere from 50 to several hundred individuals connected through direct bloodlines, all descended from common ancestors and shaped by generations of shared dietary choices and evolutionary pressures. The kindred structure predates Kroot contact with other spacefaring species by millennia, having emerged naturally from their tribal existence on Pech, where family groups competed for territory and prey. This organizational model proved so effective that it persisted even as Kroot civilization expanded across the stars, with kindreds maintaining their cohesion aboard warspheres and in service to the Tau Empire. Each kindred operates with considerable autonomy, making its own decisions regarding prey selection, evolutionary direction, and acceptance of mercenary contracts or military service. The bonds within a kindred run deeper than simple familial connection. Members share not just genetic heritage, but evolutionary destiny, knowing that the choices they make about what to consume will directly affect their descendants. This creates a sense of collective responsibility that pervades kindred decision-making. Warriors consider not just whether a particular battle serves their immediate interests, but whether the prey available justifies the risk to the bloodline. A kindred might refuse a lucrative contract if the enemies they would face offer no valuable evolutionary traits, or might accept a dangerous mission specifically because the opponents possess characteristics worth incorporating. At the apex of each kindred's hierarchy stands the Shaper, an individual who combines the roles of genetic engineer, spiritual leader, tactical commander, and keeper of accumulated evolutionary knowledge. The position of Shaper is not strictly hereditary, though Shapers often emerge from lineages that have produced previous Shapers. Instead, the role is earned through demonstrated understanding of the evolutionary consumption process, wisdom in guiding the kindred's development, and the respect of the warriors who will follow their direction. A Shaper must possess intimate knowledge of which prey confers which traits, understanding built through years of study under a master Shaper and observation of how different dietary choices affect subsequent generations. They must be able to examine an unfamiliar creature and make educated assessments about what consuming it might produce in Kroot offspring. The Shaper's authority within their kindred is absolute in matters of consumption and evolutionary direction. When a Shaper declares certain prey forbidden or mandates consumption of specific targets, the kindred obeys without question. This is not blind obedience born of authoritarianism, but rather recognition that the Shaper's decisions affect the bloodline's future in ways that extend far beyond any individual's lifespan. A warrior might disagree with a Shaper's tactical decisions or question the wisdom of accepting a particular contract, and such disagreements are resolved through discussion and consensus building. But when a Shaper issues dietary restrictions or consumption requirements based on evolutionary concerns, compliance is immediate and total. The alternative, allowing individuals to consume whatever they wish without guidance, risks the kind of uncontrolled evolution that produces devolved hounds or worse. Shapers are distinguished visually by their more elaborate quill arrangements, with longer and more numerous sensory quills emerging from their heads and shoulders in patterns that denote their status. Many Shapers carry staffs or ritual implements decorated with trophies from significant prey, each item representing an evolutionary milestone achieved under their guidance. Their equipment often includes specialized tools for examining prey, determining the freshness and quality of flesh, and performing the ritualistic preparation of consumed matter. A Shaper's rifle, while functionally similar to those carried by standard warriors, typically features decorative elements and modifications that reflect their elevated position within the kindred. Below the Shaper, kindred hierarchy organizes around functional roles rather than rigid ranks. The most numerous category consists of the standard warriors who form the core of any kindred's fighting strength. These Kroot have followed the balanced evolutionary path that their Shaper determined appropriate for the kindred as a whole, consuming varied prey in proportions designed to maintain versatility while enhancing general combat effectiveness. They carry the distinctive Kroot rifles that serve as both ranged weapons and vicious close combat implements, the integrated blades capable of disemboweling enemies with sweeping strikes. Standard warriors train constantly in the use of these weapons, practicing the fluid transitions between shooting and melee that characterize Kroot combat doctrine. Their training emphasizes individual initiative and small unit tactics, as Kroot warfare rarely involves the rigid formations favored by some other species. trackers represent a specialized evolutionary path within many kindreds, warriors who have been shaped through selective consumption to excel at reconnaissance and long-range engagement. The development of tracker variants involves feeding specific bloodlines on prey with enhanced sensory capabilities and lean, efficient musculature suited for extended pursuits. Over several generations, this produces Kroot with heightened awareness, improved visual acuity at distance, and the stamina necessary for days-long tracking operations. Trackers often operate independently or in small groups, ranging ahead of the main kindred to locate prey or enemies and assess threats before the larger force commits to engagement. Their equipment reflects their specialized role, with rifles modified for improved accuracy at extended ranges and lighter gear loads that prioritize mobility over sustained combat capability. The physical differences between trackers and standard warriors are subtle but noticeable to other Kroot. Trackers tend toward leaner builds, with slightly longer limbs that aid in covering ground efficiently. Their quills often display enhanced sensitivity, allowing them to detect environmental changes that might indicate prey or danger. Some tracker lineages have developed improved low-light vision or enhanced olfactory capabilities, traits incorporated through consumption of prey with similar characteristics. These adaptations make trackers invaluable for operations in difficult terrain or against enemies who favor stealth and ambush tactics. However, the same specializations that make trackers effective scouts can leave them somewhat less capable in sustained close combat compared to standard warriors who have maintained more balanced physical development. Hound Masters occupy another specialized niche within kindred structure, responsible for managing and directing the devolved Kroot Hounds that many kindreds maintain. This role requires specific temperament and skills, as hounds respond to handlers who can project the appropriate combination of dominance and reward. Hound Masters train from youth to work with the creatures, learning to read their body language and control them through vocal commands, scent markers, and physical discipline when necessary. A skilled Hound Master can direct a pack of hounds with precision, releasing them at optimal moments to disrupt enemy formations or pursue fleeing targets. The relationship between Hound Master and their charges exists somewhere between trainer and alpha predator, with the hounds recognizing their handler's authority while retaining enough autonomy to act on predatory instincts during combat. Krootox handlers face different challenges than Hound Masters, as their charges possess greater size and strength but limited intelligence. Managing a Krootox requires patience and understanding of the creature's capabilities and limitations. Handlers train their Krootox to respond to specific commands, teaching them to advance, halt, or charge on direction. The process involves consistent reinforcement and careful management of the creature's aggressive instincts. During combat, Krootox handlers ride their charges or direct them from nearby positions, using their weapons to support the Krootox's devastating physical attacks. A handler must possess the courage to remain close to a creature that could easily kill them accidentally, trusting in their training and the bond developed through constant interaction. Above individual kindreds exists another layer of Kroot social organization centered on master shapers, individuals who have achieved such profound understanding of evolutionary consumption that they advise multiple kindreds and coordinate their development toward complementary rather than redundant specializations. Master shapers are rare, emerging only after decades of experience guiding a single kindred and demonstrating wisdom that earns respect across Kroot society. They serve as living repositories of evolutionary knowledge, having observed the results of countless dietary choices across multiple generations and numerous bloodlines. When kindreds gather for major undertakings, or when multiple kindreds operate together in Tau military campaigns, master shapers provide coordination that allows different kindreds to function as a cohesive force despite their independent nature. Master shapers also adjudicate disputes between kindreds, particularly conflicts over prey rights or evolutionary paths that might lead to competition rather than cooperation. Their authority derives from respect rather than formal power structures, but their judgments are typically accepted because all Kroot recognize that master shapers act in service of the species' long-term survival and development. A master shaper might determine that one kindred has priority claim to specific prey based on their evolutionary needs, or might direct multiple kindreds to pursue complementary adaptations that will make them more effective when operating together. These decisions balance immediate kindred interests against broader considerations of Kroot diversity and capability across the species as a whole. The meritocratic nature of Kroot society manifests most clearly in how kindreds establish and maintain their status within greater Kroot civilization. Reputation among the Kroot is earned through demonstrated capability in combat and wise evolutionary choices that produce successful adaptations. A kindred that consistently succeeds in difficult contracts, that develops valuable specialized capabilities, or that produces warriors of exceptional quality gains, standing that translates into practical benefits. High-status kindreds receive priority consideration for lucrative mercenary work, can claim better territories on Pech or other Kroot-settled worlds, and find their shapers' counsel sought by other kindreds facing similar evolutionary decisions. This meritocracy operates without formal ranking systems or bureaucratic structures. Instead, reputation spreads through the networks of communication that connect kindreds across the galaxy. When kindreds gather, warriors share stories of their exploits and their bloodline's adaptations. Shapers discuss the evolutionary paths they have pursued and the results achieved. Success in battle, particularly against formidable opponents, enhances a kindred's reputation. So too does the development of useful specialized capabilities that fill needed roles within Kroot society or Tau military operations. A kindred that evolves effective adaptations for void combat, for instance, gains status as other kindreds recognize the value of such specialization and may seek to incorporate similar traits into their own bloodlines through controlled consumption and shaper guidance. Conversely, kindreds that make poor evolutionary choices or that fail repeatedly in combat lose status within Kroot society. Other kindreds become reluctant to fight alongside them. Employers question their effectiveness, and their shapers' advice carries less weight in collective discussions. In extreme cases, a kindred that has devolved through unwise consumption or that has violated fundamental taboos may find itself ostracized entirely, forced to operate in isolation until they can rebuild their reputation through demonstrated reform. This social pressure serves as a powerful regulatory mechanism, encouraging shapers to make conservative, proven choices rather than risky experiments that might produce spectacular results or catastrophic failures. The relationship between individual kindreds and the broader Kroot species creates a dynamic tension between independence and cooperation. Each kindred jealously guards its autonomy, making its own decisions about evolutionary direction and operational commitments. Yet kindreds also recognize that their species' strength derives from diversity, from maintaining multiple bloodlines that have adapted to different environments and combat roles. A single kindred optimized for jungle warfare might dominate in that environment, but struggle in urban combat or void operations. The existence of multiple kindreds pursuing different evolutionary paths ensures that Kroot as a species can adapt to any situation by deploying appropriately specialized forces. This principle extends to Kroot service within the Tau Empire, where different kindreds have developed reputations for specific capabilities that Tau commanders learn to recognize and request. Some kindreds are known for their tracking and reconnaissance abilities, others for shock assault tactics, still others for their ability to operate in extreme environments that would challenge standard forces. Tau military planners consult with master shapers when organizing campaigns, identifying which kindreds possess the capabilities most suited to anticipated operational requirements. The kindreds themselves compete for assignments that offer the most valuable prey or the greatest opportunities for enhancing their reputations, creating a marketplace of sorts where military effectiveness and evolutionary opportunity intersect. The basic tactical unit of Kroot military organization is the Carnivore Squad, typically consisting of 10 to 20 warriors led by a shaper or experienced warrior designated as the squad leader. This formation size reflects practical considerations developed through millennia of hunting and warfare on Pech, representing the optimal balance between combat effectiveness and operational flexibility. A squad of this size can operate independently for extended periods, provide sufficient firepower to engage most threats, and remain small enough to move through difficult terrain without compromising stealth. The carnivore squad structure predates Kroot integration into Tau military operations and has proven adaptable enough to function effectively within the more formalized command structures that Tau doctrine requires. Within Tau fire caste armies, Kroot auxiliaries fill a specialized role that addresses specific weaknesses in standard Tau military doctrine. Fire warriors excel at coordinated ranged combat, establishing defensive positions and delivering devastating volumes of pulse rifle fire against approaching enemies. However, Tau forces historically struggled when enemies closed to melee range, as fire warrior training emphasizes marksmanship and fire discipline over close quarters combat skills. Battle suits provide some answer to this vulnerability, but their deployment is limited by availability and tactical considerations. Kroot auxiliaries solve this problem by serving as dedicated close combat specialists who can engage enemies at ranges where Tau forces become significantly less effective. The integration of Kroot squads into Tau military formations follows established patterns that have evolved through decades of joint operations. A typical Tau hunter cadre might include several carnivore squads positioned to protect the flanks of fire warrior teams or to hold objectives in terrain that favors close quarters fighting. Tau commanders deploy Kroot to secure dense forests, urban ruins, or industrial complexes where their natural abilities provide advantages that compensate for the technological superiority Tau forces enjoy in open terrain. This deployment pattern allows fire warriors to focus on their primary role of delivering ranged firepower, while Kroot handle situations requiring different capabilities. Communication between Tau commanders and Kroot forces operates through shapers who serve as intermediaries, translating Tau tactical objectives into operational plans that account for Kroot combat methods and evolutionary considerations. A Tau chassui might issue orders to secure a specific objective or eliminate an enemy formation, but the shaper determines how their kindred will accomplish this goal. This arrangement requires Tau officers to accept a degree of tactical autonomy that runs counter to their preference for centralized coordination. Experienced Tau commanders learn to work with this system rather than against it, understanding that Kroot effectiveness depends on allowing them to fight according to their nature, while ensuring their actions support overall operational goals. The fundamental principle underlying Kroot warfare doctrine is the ambush, a tactical approach refined through countless generations of hunting on Pech, where success meant eating and failure meant starvation. Kroot forces avoid static defensive positions and frontal assaults whenever possible, instead maneuvering to attack from unexpected directions at moments when enemies are vulnerable. Their natural abilities support this doctrine perfectly. Kroot can move through difficult terrain that would slow or halt other infantry forces, their climbing capabilities allowing them to traverse vertical surfaces and establish positions in locations enemies consider inaccessible. Their sensory quills provide advance warning of approaching threats, while their patient hunter's mentality allows them to remain motionless for extended periods while waiting for optimal attack opportunities. A typical Kroot ambush begins long before the actual engagement. Trackers scout enemy movements, identifying patrol patterns, supply routes, and vulnerabilities in enemy dispositions. This reconnaissance operates at ranges and in terrain where technological detection systems often prove less effective than Kroot's sensory capabilities and fieldcraft. The trackers report to their shaper, who analyzes the information and determines the optimal location and timing for the ambush. The carnivore squads then move into position, using natural cover and their ability to remain motionless to avoid detection. They position themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, while ensuring multiple escape routes remain available should the engagement turn unfavorable. When the ambush is triggered, Kroot forces open fire with their rifles at ranges where their weapons remain effective, typically between 50 and 100 meters depending on terrain and visibility. The initial volley aims to inflict maximum casualties and disrupt enemy formation before closing to melee range. Kroot marksmanship, while not matching the precision of Tau fire warriors or the volume of fire produced by Imperial Guard massed volleys, proves effective enough to eliminate key targets and create confusion. The rifle's relatively simple mechanism requires minimal maintenance and operates reliably in conditions that would compromise more sophisticated weapons, an important consideration for forces that often operate without extensive logistical support. The transition from ranged combat to melee represents the moment when Kroot forces become truly devastating. As soon as their initial fire has achieved its purpose, Kroot warriors surge forward in a coordinated charge that uses their superior speed and agility to close distance before enemies can respond effectively. The charge itself serves psychological as well as tactical purposes, as the sight of lean, beaked warriors rushing forward while releasing hunting shrieks often breaks the morale of less disciplined forces. Kroot warriors strike with their rifle blades in sweeping arcs designed to disembowel or decapitate, while their free hands employ the vicious claws that tip their fingers to tear at exposed flesh. The beak provides another weapon, capable of crushing skulls or tearing out throats when warriors close to grappling range. Kroot close combat technique emphasizes fluid movement and the exploitation of reach advantages provided by their long limbs and integrated rifle blades. They avoid static exchanges of blows in favor of constant motion, circling opponents while delivering strikes from unexpected angles. A Kroot warrior engages multiple enemies simultaneously when necessary, using superior agility to avoid being surrounded while maintaining offensive pressure against all threats. The integration of rifle and blade into a single weapon allows seamless transitions between shooting and striking, with warriors firing at point-blank range into one opponent while simultaneously cutting down another. This fighting style requires extensive training and natural coordination that many species simply cannot match. The Kroot understanding of terrain exploitation goes beyond simple use of cover and concealment. They view terrain as an active element of combat rather than merely the environment in which fighting occurs. Dense forests become three-dimensional battle spaces where Kroot move through the canopy as easily as across the ground, dropping onto enemies from above or using elevated positions to avoid ground-based threats. Urban ruins provide countless ambush positions and routes for rapid flanking maneuvers, with Kroot scaling damaged buildings to establish firing positions or using rubble-choked streets to channel enemies into kill zones. Even open terrain offers opportunities for Kroot forces who understand how to use subtle variations in elevation, vegetation patterns, and natural features to mask their movements and create advantageous engagement conditions. When operating alongside Tau forces, Kroot tactical doctrine adapts to complement fire cast capabilities while maintaining its essential character. Kroot squads position themselves to protect Tau flanks, engaging enemies who attempt to maneuver around fire warrior positions or who break through initial defensive lines. They screen advancing Tau forces, eliminating scouts and forward elements before they can report Tau dispositions. In offensive operations, Kroot clear fortified positions that would require extensive firepower for Tau forces to reduce, using their close combat capabilities to eliminate defenders at minimal cost. The synergy between Tau range superiority and Kroot melee effectiveness creates combined arms capabilities that exceed what either force could achieve independently. The Kroot rifle represents the perfect embodiment of their practical approach to warfare, a weapon that serves multiple purposes without requiring sophisticated maintenance or extensive training to use effectively. The rifle consists of a solid stock carved from Pech hardwood or similar materials, a relatively simple firing mechanism that launches solid projectiles through electromagnetic acceleration, and a long blade integrated into the weapon's structure. The blade extends from beneath the barrel, curving slightly forward in a configuration that allows it to function as both spear and axe depending on how the wielder strikes. The edge is maintained through regular sharpening rather than technological means, and the blade's simple construction means that damaged weapons can be repaired in the field using basic tools. The rifle's firing mechanism operates on principles that Kroot understand through practice rather than theoretical knowledge. A power cell provides energy that accelerates metallic projectiles to lethal velocities, with the weapon capable of firing in both semi-automatic and fully automatic modes depending on the trigger pressure applied. The projectiles themselves are simple solid slugs without sophisticated guidance systems or exotic materials, but they prove effective against most infantry targets at typical engagement ranges. The rifle lacks the range and armor penetration capabilities of Tau pulse rifles or Imperial lasguns, but its reliability and dual-purpose nature make it ideally suited to Kroot combat doctrine, where engagements typically occur at close range and transition rapidly to melee. Traditional Kroot hunting weapons remain in use alongside the standard rifle, particularly among kindreds that maintain strong connections to their pre-spacefaring heritage. These weapons include various spears, axes, and bladed implements crafted according to patterns passed down through generations. Some warriors carry throwing weapons designed to bring down prey at distance, while others prefer longer blades for close combat situations where the rifle's integrated blade proves insufficient. Shapers often carry traditional staves or ritual weapons that serve ceremonial purposes while remaining functional combat implements. The continued use of these traditional weapons reflects Kroot cultural values that emphasize connection to their hunting heritage, but also provides practical backup options when rifles malfunction or run out of ammunition. The Tau have offered Kroot auxiliaries access to more advanced technology on numerous occasions, including pulse weapons, targeting systems, and protective equipment that would enhance their combat effectiveness by conventional metrics. Most Kroot kindreds have declined these offers or accepted them only in limited quantities. This rejection stems from practical rather than ideological considerations. Sophisticated Tau technology requires maintenance infrastructure and technical knowledge that Kroot forces operating independently cannot reliably access. Equipment failures in the field could leave warriors defenseless, while dependence on Tau supply chains would compromise the operational independence that Kroot forces value. The Kroot rifle's simple construction means that any warrior can perform basic maintenance and repairs, while its integrated blade ensures the weapon remains useful even if the firing mechanism fails completely. Some equipment of Tau origin has found acceptance among Kroot forces where it provides clear benefits without creating problematic dependencies. Improved power cells for Kroot rifles offer longer operational life and more shots per charge without requiring fundamental changes to weapon operation or maintenance. Enhanced optical sights help trackers engage targets at extended ranges, though many Kroot prefer to rely on their natural visual acuity. Communication equipment allows better coordination with Tau forces during joint operations, though Kroot also maintain traditional methods of silent signaling for situations where electronic communication proves impractical or risks detection. The selective adoption of Tau technology demonstrates Kroot pragmatism, accepting innovations that enhance their capabilities while rejecting those that would compromise their operational flexibility or cultural identity. Kroot Hounds serve crucial roles in military operations despite their devolved status, functioning as both tracking assets and expendable assault troops. A typical carnivore squad might include several hounds controlled by a hound master who directs them through vocal commands and scent markers. During reconnaissance operations, hounds range ahead of the main force, their enhanced olfactory senses detecting enemies or prey long before visual contact occurs. Their ability to follow scent trails allows Kroot forces to track fleeing enemies or locate hidden positions that would otherwise remain undetected. In combat, hounds are released to harry enemy formations, their speed and low profile making them difficult targets, while their vicious bites and claws inflict casualties that force enemies to divert attention from the main Kroot force. The tactical employment of hounds requires careful judgment from shapers and hound masters. Released too early, hounds may alert enemies to the Kroot presence before ambush positions are fully established. Held too long, they miss opportunities to disrupt enemy formations or pursue fleeing targets. Skilled Hound masters read battlefield conditions and release their charges at moments of maximum impact, typically just as the main Kroot force initiates its charge or when enemy cohesion begins to break. The psychological effect of Hounds rushing forward alongside Kroot warriors amplifies the terror that Kroot charges already inspire, as enemies face threats from multiple directions at different heights. Hounds also serve as expendable scouts in situations where risking Kroot lives would be inappropriate, sent forward to trigger traps or reveal hidden positions through their attacks. Krootox provide heavy support capabilities that standard Kroot warriors cannot match, their massive size and strength allowing them to carry weapons that would require vehicle mounting for other infantry forces. The most common Krootox loadout consists of a heavy Kroot gun mounted on a harness secured to the creature's back, with the handler directing fire while managing the Krootox's movement. These heavy guns fire larger projectiles at higher velocities than standard Kroot rifles, capable of threatening light vehicles and suppressing enemy heavy weapons teams. The Krootox itself serves as a weapons platform of considerable durability, its thick hide providing protection equivalent to light armor, while its bulk allows it to absorb hits that would kill standard infantry. In close combat, a Krootox can simply trample enemies or strike them with its powerful limbs, with each blow capable of crushing bones and pulping flesh. The tactical deployment of Krootox requires different considerations than standard carnivore squads. Their size makes them unsuitable for the infiltration and ambush tactics that characterize most Kroot operations, as they cannot move through dense terrain as easily as their smaller cousins, and their presence is difficult to conceal. Instead, Krootox typically deploy in support roles, providing covering fire while carnivore squads maneuver or advancing alongside them to exploit breakthroughs created by the main force. When operating with Tau forces, Krootox often position themselves near fire warrior teams, adding their heavy guns to the volume of fire directed at approaching enemies, while serving as physical barriers that protect against enemies who break through the initial defensive line. Great Narlock cavalry represents the closest equivalent to traditional mounted warfare in Kroot military organization, though the relationship between rider and mount differs significantly from conventional cavalry traditions. Narlocks are aggressive, territorial creatures whose natural instincts must be constantly managed by their riders. A Narlock cavalry charge delivers devastating impact as the massive reptilian creatures thunder forward, their riders directing them toward enemy formations while firing their rifles from the saddle. The Narlocks themselves attack with natural weapons including powerful jaws and clawed feet, trampling enemies and creating gaps in defensive lines that following Kroot infantry exploit. The psychological impact of Narlock charges rivals their physical effectiveness, as few infantry forces maintain cohesion when faced with multi-ton reptilian predators bearing down on their positions. Narlock cavalry operates most effectively in open terrain where the creatures can build momentum and where their size provides advantages rather than limitations. They serve as shock troops in Kroot battle plans, held in reserve until the moment when their charge will create maximum disruption. A well-timed Narlock assault can shatter enemy formations, break sieges, or pursue rooted enemies with ruthless efficiency. However, their effectiveness diminishes in confined spaces or heavily forested terrain where their size becomes a liability. Narlock riders must possess exceptional courage and skill, as controlling these creatures during the chaos of battle requires constant attention and firm handling. The bond between rider and mount develops through extensive training, with experienced cavalry warriors able to direct their Narlocks with subtle cues that leave their hands free to wield weapons. The integration of these specialized units into coherent battle plans demonstrates the sophistication underlying Kroot military organization despite their apparent primitiveness. A Shaper commanding Kroot forces in battle coordinates carnivore squads, Hound packs, Krootox support, and Narlock cavalry into combined arms operations that exploit each element's strengths while compensating for weaknesses. Trackers provide intelligence that allows the Shaper to identify enemy vulnerabilities and optimal attack vectors. carnivore squads maneuver to establish ambush positions or to exploit opportunities created by other elements. Hounds harry enemy flanks and pursue broken formations. Krootox provide sustained fire support and serve as rallying points. Narlocks deliver shock attacks that create openings for exploitation. This coordination occurs without the elaborate communication networks and rigid command structures that other armies require, instead relying on shaper judgment, warrior initiative, and the intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics that Kroot develop through constant training and combat experience. The Kroot presence extends far beyond their service to the Tau Empire, with numerous kindreds operating as independent mercenaries throughout the galaxy. These mercenary bands pursue their own evolutionary agendas while seeking diverse genetic material and combat experience that their association with any single employer could never provide. The mercenary tradition predates Kroot contact with the Tau by millennia, emerging naturally from their warsphere-based expansion across the stars when individual kindreds discovered they could trade martial prowess for access to new battlefields and prey species. This tradition continues despite the benefits of Tau alliance, as many kindreds maintain that true evolutionary advancement requires exposure to the widest possible variety of genetic material rather than the limited selection available through service to a single empire. The decision to operate as independent mercenaries rather than commit fully to Tau's service reflects fundamental aspects of Kroot nature. Each kindred views itself as an autonomous entity pursuing its own evolutionary destiny, and while cooperation with the Tau offers significant advantages, exclusive service would limit opportunities to consume prey from conflicts beyond Tau borders. A kindred fighting solely for the Tau encounters primarily the enemies that threaten Tau expansion: orcs, imperial forces, and occasional encounters with other Xeno species. A mercenary kindred can potentially access battlefields across the entire galaxy, facing diverse opponents whose genetic material might confer adaptations unavailable through Tau service alone. This broader exposure accelerates evolutionary development in ways that justify the risks and uncertainties inherent in mercenary work. Rogue traders represent some of the most frequent employers of Kroot mercenary bands, as these independent Imperial operatives require reliable military forces for their ventures beyond the Imperium's borders. A rogue trader's warrant of trade grants them authority to negotiate with Xeno species and employ alien auxiliaries in ways that would be heretical for conventional Imperial commanders. Kroot mercenaries provide these traders with capable warriors who can operate in diverse environments, require minimal logistical support, and bring specialized capabilities that standard Imperial forces often lack. The relationship proves mutually beneficial. Rogue traders gain effective troops for their expeditions, while Kroot kindreds access regions of the galaxy they might never reach independently and encounter prey species that exist only in the most remote sectors. A typical contract between a rogue trader and Kroot kindred specifies duration of service, payment terms, and operational parameters that govern Kroot conduct during the engagement. Payment might include currency, equipment, or transportation to specific regions, but the most valuable compensation from the Kroot perspective is access to combat zones where desirable prey exists. A shaper negotiating such contracts evaluates potential employers based not just on offered payment, but on the evolutionary opportunities the service will provide. A contract that promises exposure to physically powerful enemies or species with unique adaptations holds more appeal than one offering higher monetary compensation, but only conventional opponents. Rogue traders who understand this aspect of Kroot motivation can negotiate more favorable terms by emphasizing the diversity of threats their ventures will encounter. The employment of Kroot by Imperial commanders occurs less frequently than service to rogue traders, but represents a significant aspect of their mercenary operations. These arrangements typically emerge in frontier regions, where Imperial authority operates with greater flexibility than in the Imperium's core territories, or in situations where conventional Imperial forces prove insufficient for specific threats. An Imperial Guard commander facing orc infestations in dense jungle terrain might hire Kroot mercenaries, whose natural abilities provide advantages that standard infantry units cannot match. Planetary governors dealing with insurgencies or Xenos incursions sometimes employ Kroot forces when Imperial reinforcements remain unavailable, or when the situation requires capabilities that Guard regiments lack. These contracts must be structured carefully to avoid attracting unwanted attention from the Inquisition, as the employment of Xenos mercenaries occupies a legal and moral gray area within Imperial doctrine. Imperial commanders who work with Kroot mercenaries often find themselves impressed by their effectiveness while simultaneously disturbed by their practices. A Guard officer might appreciate the Kroot's ability to clear enemy positions with minimal Imperial casualties, but witnessing their consumption of fallen enemies afterward creates visceral discomfort that no amount of tactical benefit can entirely overcome. The cultural gap between Imperial forces raised on doctrines of human supremacy and Xenos, as abominations versus Kroot who view consumption as natural and necessary, creates tensions that require careful management from both sides. Successful cooperation typically requires Imperial commanders who can set aside their indoctrination enough to recognize Kroot effectiveness, while Kroot shapers must restrain their warriors' feeding practices to avoid provoking incidents that could terminate profitable contracts. The reputation Kroot mercenaries have earned among Imperial forces varies dramatically depending on who offers the assessment. Pragmatic commanders who have worked with Kroot forces and witnessed their capabilities firsthand often speak with grudging respect about their effectiveness in specific tactical situations. These officers recognize that Kroot excel in roles where standard Imperial forces struggle: reconnaissance in hostile terrain, close quarters combat in urban or forested environments, and operations requiring forces that can sustain themselves without extensive supply lines. Stories circulate through Imperial military networks about Kroot mercenaries who turned the tide of desperate battles or accomplished objectives that would have cost hundreds of Imperial lives if attempted by conventional forces. Conversely, many Imperial commanders view Kroot with deep suspicion rooted in their Xenos nature and their consumption practices. These officers consider the employment of alien mercenaries a sign of weakness or desperation, arguing that proper Imperial forces should suffice for any legitimate military objective. The Kroot practice of consuming fallen enemies strikes many Imperials as barbaric and potentially heretical, raising concerns about what happens to Imperial dead when Kroot operate in the same battle space. Reports of Kroot feeding on human corpses, even those of enemies, generate outrage and disgust that overshadows any tactical benefits their service might provide. This faction within the Imperial military hierarchy actively opposes Kroot employment and works to ensure that commanders who hire Xenos mercenaries face scrutiny and potential censure for their decisions. The Inquisition maintains a complex and often contradictory stance toward Kroot mercenaries that reflects the diverse philosophies present within that ancient institution. Radical inquisitors operating in the Ordo Xenos sometimes employ Kroot forces for specific operations, recognizing that their capabilities provide unique advantages for missions beyond the Imperium's borders or in situations where conventional Imperial assets would prove unsuitable. These inquisitors view Kroot as tools to be used and discarded as circumstances require, no different in principle from the various other Xenos assets that radical elements within the Inquisition occasionally utilize. They justify such employment through necessity, and the argument that using Xenos to combat greater threats serves the Emperor's interests, even if it violates conventional doctrine. Puritan factions within the Inquisition take the opposite view, regarding Kroot mercenaries as Xenos threats that must be eliminated whenever encountered. These inquisitors point to the Kroot practice of consuming sentient beings as evidence of their fundamental incompatibility with humanity and the Emperor's vision for the galaxy. They argue that allowing Kroot to operate within Imperial space, even as mercenaries serving Imperial interests, represents a dangerous compromise that could lead to greater Xenos infiltration. Puritan inquisitors have ordered the extermination of Kroot mercenary bands operating in Imperial territory, viewing their destruction as necessary regardless of any services they might have provided to Imperial forces. These actions create complications for Imperial commanders who have employed Kroot, as they must balance immediate tactical needs against the possibility of future inquisitorial investigation. The result of these divergent attitudes is that Kroot mercenaries operating in Imperial space face constant uncertainty about their status and safety. A contract that begins with an Imperial commander desperate for their services might end with an inquisitorial kill team hunting them once the immediate crisis passes. Kroot shapers factor this risk into their negotiations, demanding higher compensation for contracts in Imperial territory and maintaining escape routes that allow rapid withdrawal if circumstances turn hostile. Some kindreds refuse Imperial contracts entirely, judging that the combination of cultural hostility and inquisitorial threat makes such employment too dangerous regardless of potential benefits. Others specialize in Imperial service, developing expertise in navigating the complex politics and prejudices that characterize human-Kroot interactions within the Imperium's borders. Beyond Imperial space, Kroot mercenaries find employment with various other Xeno species, whose conflicts provide opportunities for both profit and evolutionary advancement. Eldar Corsair bands occasionally hire Kroot forces for operations requiring ground troops, as the Eldar themselves prefer to avoid prolonged infantry engagements when possible. These contracts expose Kroot to Eldar technology and combat methods, though the Eldar typically ensure that their Kroot employees never gain access to truly significant artifacts or knowledge. The consumption of Eldar dead remains strictly forbidden in such arrangements, with violation resulting in immediate termination of the contract and usually violent retribution. Kroot shapers accept these restrictions as necessary costs of accessing battlefields where other valuable prey exists, though they remain constantly alert for opportunities to acquire Eldar genetic material through indirect means. Other Xeno species employ Kroot mercenaries with varying frequency and for diverse purposes. Independent human colonies beyond Imperial control sometimes hire Kroot forces for defense against pirate raids or rival settlements. Minor alien civilizations facing extinction from more powerful neighbors might contract Kroot warriors as a desperate measure to bolster their military capabilities. In rare instances, Kroot have even found themselves employed by different factions within the same species' civil conflicts, with kindreds fighting on opposite sides while pursuing their own evolutionary agendas independent of their employers' political goals. These varied contracts expose Kroot to an enormous diversity of combat situations and potential prey, accelerating their evolutionary development in ways that service to any single employer could never match. The network of Kroot warspheres traveling throughout the galaxy serves as the foundation for their mercenary culture and their species' continued expansion. These ancient vessels follow established routes that connect major mercenary markets, battlefields where conflicts regularly erupt, and worlds where Kroot have established permanent or semi-permanent settlements. Each warsphere functions as a mobile base for its resident kindred, providing transportation, living space, and facilities for maintaining equipment and training warriors. The vessels also serve as trading posts where kindreds exchange information about contracts, prey species, and evolutionary developments. When multiple warspheres gather, the meetings become opportunities for shapers to share knowledge, for warriors to test themselves against members of other kindreds, and for bloodlines to intermix through carefully controlled breeding programs that shapers arrange to introduce beneficial traits from other kindred lineages. The interior of a typical warsphere reflects the dual nature of these vessels as both spacecraft and mobile homes. Large sections are devoted to habitation areas where kindred members live in conditions that approximate their ancestral environment on Pech as much as possible within the constraints of shipboard life. Shapers maintain careful control over these spaces, cultivating vegetation that serves both aesthetic and practical purposes by providing controlled food sources for specific evolutionary needs. Small fauna populations are maintained in contained environments, representing genetic repositories that kindreds can draw upon when specific traits require reinforcement or when access to external prey proves limited. The balance between maintaining traditional Kroot lifestyle and adapting to the requirements of void travel creates unique challenges that each warsphere's inhabitants solve according to their shaper's guidance and their kindred's particular traditions. Warsphere maintenance represents an ongoing challenge that kindreds address through combination of inherited knowledge and improvisation. The vessel's technology operates on principles that Kroot understand through practice rather than theoretical comprehension, with repair and modification work guided by accumulated experience passed from generation to generation. Each warsphere develops its own quirks and unique characteristics as centuries of repairs and modifications layer upon the original structure. Some systems function through what appears to be pure chance, maintained by rituals that Kroot perform without understanding the underlying mechanisms, but knowing that deviation from established procedures results in system failures. This approach to technology reflects broader Kroot philosophy that emphasizes practical results over theoretical understanding, accepting that some knowledge may be forever beyond their grasp, while ensuring they can still utilize the tools their ancestors left them. The routes that warspheres travel have been established through centuries of exploration and mercenary operations, connecting regions where Kroot services find regular demand. These paths avoid the most heavily controlled Imperial space, where inquisitorial presence makes Kroot presence too dangerous, while passing through frontier regions, independent systems, and Xenos territories where mercenary opportunities exist. Warspheres maintain irregular schedules, appearing at established gathering points when kindreds need to recruit additional warriors, trade equipment, or simply interact with other Kroot after extended periods of isolation. The network functions without central coordination, instead operating through shared knowledge of routes and timing that allows kindreds to encounter each other without requiring sophisticated communication systems or formal organization. These gatherings serve crucial functions beyond simple commerce and social interaction. Shapers use the meetings to exchange information about prey species encountered, discussing which creatures provided valuable traits and which proved dangerous or useless for evolutionary purposes. Young shapers learn from experienced masters, absorbing knowledge that will guide their own kindred's development in future generations. Warriors compete in ritual combats that test their skills and establish reputations that spread throughout the Kroot mercenary network. Kindreds negotiate alliances for major contracts that require forces beyond what a single kindred can provide, forming temporary coalitions that dissolve once the contract concludes and the participants return to independent operations. These interactions maintain cohesion within Kroot society despite the species' fundamentally decentralized nature, ensuring that knowledge and traditions spread throughout their scattered population. The genetic repositories maintained aboard warspheres represent invaluable resources that kindreds protect with absolute dedication. These collections consist of preserved tissue samples from significant prey species, maintained in specialized storage that prevents degradation while keeping the genetic material viable for consumption when needed. A kindred might maintain samples from particularly valuable prey encountered decades or even centuries earlier, consuming small amounts to reinforce specific traits or to reintroduce characteristics that have diminished through subsequent generations. The repositories also contain samples from the kindred's own bloodline at various points in their evolutionary history, allowing shapers to track changes over time and potentially reverse unwanted developments by reintroducing genetic material from earlier generations. These collections represent the accumulated evolutionary heritage of each kindred, irreplaceable records of their journey through the generations. The diversity of evolutionary paths pursued by different kindreds creates a species-wide repository of adaptations that ensures Kroot as a whole can respond to virtually any threat or environment. Some kindreds have evolved toward enhanced physical strength through sustained consumption of powerful prey, producing warriors who stand taller and more heavily muscled than their cousins. Others have pursued sensory enhancements, developing heightened awareness and tracking capabilities that make them unmatched scouts and hunters. Certain kindreds have adapted to specific environments, with some showing resistance to extreme temperatures, others developing enhanced low-light vision for operations in perpetual darkness, and still others gaining increased endurance for extended operations without rest. This diversity means that when major threats emerge, or when contracts require specialized capabilities, the broader Kroot mercenary network can provide kindreds whose evolutionary development makes them ideally suited for the specific challenges involved. The independence that characterizes Kroot mercenary culture creates both strengths and vulnerabilities for the species. Their refusal to commit fully to any single employer or alliance preserves their autonomy and ensures access to diverse evolutionary opportunities, but it also means they lack the concentrated military power and political influence that more unified species can bring to bear. Kroot mercenaries operate as individual kindreds or small coalitions, rather than as a species-wide military force, limiting their ability to influence galactic events despite their widespread presence. This fragmentation suits Kroot nature and their evolutionary philosophy, but it leaves them vulnerable to threats that target their scattered warspheres or that seek to eliminate Kroot presence from specific regions through coordinated campaigns that individual kindreds cannot effectively resist. The relationship between mercenary kindreds and those serving the Tau creates another layer of complexity within Kroot society. Kindreds committed to Tau service sometimes view their mercenary cousins as reckless or short-sighted, arguing that the stability and resources provided by Tau alliance outweigh the benefits of independent operation. Mercenary kindreds counter that their Tau-serving cousins have sacrificed too much autonomy and limited their evolutionary potential by restricting themselves to conflicts involving Tau interests. These disagreements rarely escalate to violence, as all Kroot recognize the value of maintaining diverse approaches to survival and advancement, but they create philosophical divisions that influence how different kindreds interact and cooperate. Master Shapers work to bridge these divisions, emphasizing that both paths serve the species' long-term interests by ensuring Kroot maintain both stable alliances and independent operations that provide access to opportunities beyond any single employer's reach. The Shaper stands at the absolute center of Kroot existence, embodying roles that other species divide among multiple specialists and authority figures. To understand the Shaper is to understand the fundamental organizing principle of Kroot civilization, as these individuals serve simultaneously as evolutionary engineers, spiritual leaders, military commanders, and keepers of ancestral knowledge. Their authority derives not from political maneuvering or hereditary right, but from demonstrated mastery of the evolutionary consumption process and the wisdom to guide their kindred through the countless decisions that will shape their descendants for generations to come. A Shaper's training begins in youth and continues throughout their entire life, as the complexity of managing a kindred's evolutionary path requires constant learning and adaptation to new circumstances. The path to becoming a Shaper starts when a young Kroot displays particular aptitude for understanding the relationship between consumption and evolution. This aptitude manifests in various ways: an intuitive grasp of which prey might confer specific traits, unusual interest in observing how different dietary choices affect subsequent generations, or the ability to predict evolutionary outcomes with accuracy that exceeds normal Kroot understanding. When a Shaper identifies such potential in a young warrior, they begin informal instruction that tests whether the candidate possesses not just intellectual capability, but the temperament necessary for bearing the enormous responsibility that comes with guiding a kindred's genetic destiny. Many who show initial promise fail to develop the necessary depth of understanding or the wisdom to make decisions that balance immediate needs against long-term evolutionary goals. Those who continue their training enter into a relationship with their master Shaper that resembles apprenticeship in some ways, but goes far deeper. The aspiring Shaper accompanies their teacher constantly, observing every decision and learning to read the subtle signs that indicate how different prey will affect the kindred. They learn to examine creatures they have never encountered before and make educated assessments about what traits consumption might confer. This requires understanding anatomy, behavior, and the relationship between physical characteristics and genetic expression. A thick-skinned creature might seem to promise enhanced durability, but the shaper must determine whether that thickness comes from genetic traits that Kroot physiology can incorporate or from environmental factors that would not transfer through consumption. Such distinctions mean the difference between successful adaptation and wasted opportunities, or worse. The apprentice shaper also learns the accumulated knowledge that their master inherited from previous generations, a vast repository of information about which creatures provide which traits, which combinations prove synergistic, and which lead to degeneration or unwanted side effects. This knowledge exists primarily in oral tradition, passed from master to student through countless hours of instruction and discussion. Some kindreds maintain written records using simple pictographic systems, but most shapers prefer to keep their knowledge in memory, where it cannot be lost if their warsphere suffers damage or falls into enemy hands. The memorization required is staggering, encompassing not just information about specific prey species, but the complex interactions between different genetic traits and the long-term consequences of various evolutionary paths pursued over multiple generations. Beyond the technical knowledge of evolutionary consumption, aspiring shapers must master the spiritual and philosophical dimensions of their role. Kroot spirituality centers on the understanding that they exist as part of an endless cycle of consumption and transformation, where the strength of prey becomes the strength of the predator in ways that transcend simple nutrition. When a Kroot consumes fallen enemies, they are not merely feeding their body, but incorporating the essence of that creature into their bloodline. This process carries profound implications that go beyond the physical, touching on questions of identity, legacy, and the relationship between individual and kindred. The shaper must understand these dimensions and guide their warriors to approach consumption with the proper reverence and awareness of what they are doing. Ancestor worship forms the foundation of Kroot spiritual belief, though the practice differs significantly from similar traditions in other species. The Kroot do not venerate their ancestors as distant figures to be appeased through offerings and prayer. Instead, they understand their ancestors as literally present within themselves, their genetic legacy continuing through the bloodline in ways that make each living Kroot a living continuation of all who came before. When a shaper makes decisions about evolutionary direction, they do so with awareness that they are shaping not just future generations, but honoring or potentially betraying the choices made by ancestors who guided the kindred to its current state. This creates a profound sense of continuity and responsibility that influences every significant decision a shaper makes. The belief that consumed prey's strength joins the kindred operates on multiple levels within Kroot spirituality. At the most literal level, Kroot understand that genetic material from prey becomes incorporated into their descendants, conferring physical traits and capabilities. But they also believe that something less tangible transfers through consumption, a quality they might describe as the prey's spirit or essence if pressed to explain in terms other species could understand. A kindred that regularly consumes brave warriors believes that courage becomes part of their nature. Those who feed on cunning predators feel they gain not just enhanced senses, but the predatory instincts that made their prey successful. This belief influences how Kroot approach combat and consumption, as they seek not just to kill enemies, but to honor worthy opponents by incorporating their strength into the kindred's continuing story. Legendary shapers who achieved remarkable evolutionary advances or guided their kindreds through existential threats occupy a special place in Kroot reverence. These figures are remembered through oral traditions that recount their decisions and the results they produced, serving as examples for current shapers facing similar challenges. A shaper confronting a difficult choice about evolutionary direction might recall the story of a legendary predecessor who faced comparable circumstances, considering how that ancient shaper approached the problem and what consequences followed from their decision. Similarly, warriors who distinguished themselves through exceptional prowess or who made crucial contributions to their kindred's survival earn remembrance that extends beyond their individual lifetimes. These warriors are often consumed by their own kindred after death, their strength literally incorporated into future generations, while their deeds live on in the stories that shapers tell. The practice of consuming honored dead serves multiple purposes. It prevents valuable genetic material from being wasted, it ensures the warrior's legacy continues through their descendants, and it reinforces the cyclical nature of Kroot existence, where death represents transformation rather than ending. Not all Kroot dead receive this honor, only those whose lives and deaths merit such recognition, making it an aspiration that drives warriors to seek glory in combat and service to their kindred. The proving trials that aspiring shapers must pass before assuming full responsibility for a kindred vary between different Kroot traditions, but share common elements that test both knowledge and wisdom. A typical trial requires the candidate to demonstrate comprehensive understanding of evolutionary consumption by correctly identifying the potential effects of consuming various prey species, including creatures they have never personally encountered. The testing shaper or council of elders presents specimens or detailed descriptions, and the candidate must analyze what traits consumption would likely confer, what risks it might carry, and whether it would serve the kindred's current evolutionary goals. Errors in this assessment reveal gaps in knowledge or judgment that indicate the candidate requires further training. Beyond technical knowledge, the trials test the candidate's ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. The aspiring shaper might be presented with scenarios where they must choose between competing evolutionary paths, each offering benefits but requiring different prey and leading to different long-term outcomes. They must justify their choices, demonstrating understanding not just of immediate consequences, but of how their decisions will affect the kindred across multiple generations. Some trials include elements of physical challenge, requiring the candidate to lead warriors in hunts or combat situations, where their tactical judgment and ability to command respect from experienced fighters can be evaluated. A shaper must be able to fight alongside their kindred when necessary, as authority that derives purely from knowledge without demonstrated courage and capability carries less weight in Kroot culture. The most demanding trials involve the candidate being sent to guide a small group of young Kroot through a complete hunt cycle, from identifying suitable prey through the kill and the ritual consumption that follows. The testing shapers observe from distance, evaluating how the candidate applies their knowledge in practical situations and whether they can effectively transmit understanding to less experienced warriors. This tests teaching ability as much as personal knowledge, as a shaper must be able to explain complex concepts about evolutionary consumption in ways that warriors without specialized training can understand and apply. The candidate must also demonstrate proper performance of the rituals that accompany consumption, showing mastery of the spiritual dimensions of their role alongside the technical aspects. Successful completion of the proving trials does not immediately grant full shaper status in most kindreds. Instead, the newly recognized shaper typically serves in a subordinate role under an experienced master, gradually assuming greater responsibility as they prove their judgment through actual practice. This apprentice period might last years or even decades, with the junior shaper handling routine decisions while consulting their master on matters of particular importance or complexity. Only when the master shaper judges them truly ready, or when circumstances force them to assume full responsibility due to their master's death or incapacitation, does the new shaper take complete control of the kindred's evolutionary direction. This cautious approach reflects the enormous stakes involved, as poor shaper decisions can doom entire bloodlines to degeneration or extinction. Ritual feasts after successful campaigns serve functions that go far beyond simple celebration or sustenance. These gatherings represent the culmination of the entire combat operation, the moment when the kindred reaps the evolutionary rewards for which they risked their lives. The feast follows strict protocols that shapers enforce with absolute authority, as the consumption that occurs during these events directly shapes future generations. The shaper examines all available prey, determining which warriors will consume which portions based on the kindred's evolutionary needs and each warrior's place within the bloodline. A warrior whose descendants the shaper wishes to enhance with particular traits receives choice portions that will maximize incorporation of desired genetic material. Others might be restricted from certain prey if the shaper judges that their bloodline should develop along different paths. The feast itself unfolds with ceremonial elements that acknowledge the significance of what is occurring. Warriors do not simply gorge themselves on fallen enemies, but consume their portions with awareness that they are participating in their species' defining characteristic. Shapers often speak during the feast, explaining why particular prey was selected and what traits the kindred hopes to gain through its consumption. They might recount the deeds of warriors who fell in the campaign, honoring their sacrifice while noting how their loss affects the kindred's genetic diversity and future capabilities. The atmosphere combines solemnity with satisfaction, recognizing both the evolutionary opportunity the feast represents and the costs that were paid to secure it. Portions of particularly significant prey are sometimes preserved for future consumption rather than eaten immediately. A shaper might determine that genetic material from an exceptional opponent should be incorporated gradually over multiple generations rather than consumed all at once, or that samples should be stored in the kindred's genetic repository for use when specific traits require reinforcement. These decisions require careful judgment about balancing immediate evolutionary gains against long-term strategic considerations. The preserved samples become part of the kindred's heritage, physical links to important moments in their history that can be drawn upon when circumstances require the traits that particular prey represented. Death rites involving ritual consumption serve as the final expression of Kroot beliefs about the cycle of life and transformation. When a Kroot warrior falls in battle, their body represents valuable genetic material that should not go to waste. If circumstances permit, fallen kindred members are consumed by their surviving relatives, their strength literally passing into the next generation rather than being lost. This practice strikes many other species as horrific, but Kroot view it as the highest honor they can pay their dead, ensuring that the fallen warrior's legacy continues through their descendants. The consumption is performed with reverence, often accompanied by recitations of the warrior's deeds and acknowledgement of how their genetic contribution will benefit future generations. Not all Kroot dead are consumed by their own kindred. Warriors who died through cowardice or whose actions brought shame to the bloodline might be denied this honor, their bodies left for scavengers or disposed of in ways that ensure their genetic material does not continue. This represents the ultimate dishonor in Kroot culture, a declaration that the individual's contribution to the kindred's evolutionary journey has been judged worthless or actively harmful. The threat of such treatment serves as powerful motivation for warriors to conduct themselves honorably and to prioritize kindred welfare over individual survival. Conversely, particularly honored dead might be consumed by the shaper themselves or by warriors specifically selected for their promising bloodlines, ensuring that the deceased's genetic legacy continues through the kindred's strongest lines. Shaper councils convene when decisions affect multiple kindreds or when circumstances require coordination beyond what individual shapers can provide. These gatherings typically occur when warspheres meet at established rendezvous points, allowing shapers from different kindreds to discuss matters of mutual concern. The councils lack formal structure or permanent membership, instead forming organically around specific issues that require collective consideration. A council might address questions about evolutionary directions that multiple kindreds are pursuing, determining whether their paths complement each other or risk creating redundancy that weakens Kroot capability overall. They might coordinate responses to major threats that individual kindreds cannot effectively counter, organizing temporary alliances that pool resources and capabilities to address existential dangers. Mercenary contracts that involve multiple kindreds require Shaper Council approval and coordination. When an employer seeks to hire Kroot forces beyond what a single kindred can provide, the contract terms must be negotiated collectively to ensure all participating kindreds receive appropriate compensation and evolutionary opportunities. The Council determines how prey will be divided among participating kindreds, how casualties will be allocated across different bloodlines, and how disputes during the contract will be resolved. These negotiations can become complex when kindreds have pursued different evolutionary paths and therefore value different types of prey, requiring careful balancing to ensure all participants judge the arrangement equitable. Responses to existential threats represent the most serious matters that Shaper councils address. When dangers emerge that threaten Kroot as a species rather than just individual kindreds, the councils must coordinate defensive measures and determine what sacrifices different kindreds will make for collective survival. The orc invasion of Pech that led to the alliance with the Tau involved extensive Shaper Council deliberations about whether to accept Tau assistance and what terms such an alliance should follow. Similar councils have addressed other major threats throughout Kroot history, making decisions that shaped their species' development and determined which evolutionary paths would be pursued or abandoned based on changing circumstances in the galaxy. The spiritual authority that Shapers wield extends beyond their technical knowledge of evolutionary consumption into realms that other species might categorize as religious leadership. Shapers interpret the meaning of significant events, determining whether particular outcomes represent favorable or unfavorable signs for the kindred's future. They perform ceremonies marking important transitions in the kindred's life cycle: births of new generations, the first hunts of young warriors, the deaths of honored members. Through these ceremonies, Shapers reinforce the beliefs and values that hold Kroot society together, emphasizing the importance of wise consumption, respect for prey, and commitment to the kindred's evolutionary destiny above individual concerns. The relationship between Shapers and their warriors operates on mutual dependence rather than simple hierarchy. Warriors rely on their Shapers' guidance to ensure their sacrifices in battle serve the kindred's long-term interests, trusting that dietary restrictions and consumption requirements serve purposes they may not fully understand, but accept as necessary. The Shaper depends on their warriors to secure the prey that evolutionary advancement requires, recognizing that even the wisest guidance means nothing if the kindred cannot successfully hunt the creatures whose consumption will benefit future generations. This interdependence creates bonds of loyalty and respect that go beyond what formal authority structures could produce, as both Shaper and warriors understand that their fates are inextricably linked through the generations. The greatest existential threat to the Kroot species comes not from external enemies, but from within, manifesting through the very mechanism that defines their evolutionary advantage. Chaos corruption through consumption of tainted flesh represents an absolute horror that can destroy entire kindreds with devastating speed and finality. Unlike conventional enemies that can be fought with blade and rifle, chaos corruption operates at the genetic and spiritual levels simultaneously, warping both body and mind in ways that the Kroot hyperadaptive physiology cannot resist. The specialized organs that allow Kroot to analyze and incorporate beneficial genetic traits become vectors for demonic influence when exposed to chaos-tainted flesh, spreading corruption through the digestive system and into the reproductive cells that will shape future generations. The documented cases of kindreds falling to chaos corruption follow disturbingly similar patterns. Initial consumption of tainted flesh often produces no immediately obvious effects, leading warriors and sometimes even Shapers to believe the meat was safe. The corruption manifests in subsequent generations, with offspring displaying mutations that begin subtly before accelerating into grotesque transformations. A kindred might notice enhanced aggression in their young, attributing it to consumption of fierce prey, only to watch as that aggression metastasizes into uncontrollable bloodlust. Physical mutations follow, with flesh twisting into configurations that serve no evolutionary purpose, but instead reflect the touch of the warp. Quills might grow into writhing tendrils, beaks elongate into lamprey like maws lined with multiple rows of teeth, or limbs multiply in ways that destroy the warrior's ability to function effectively. The mental degradation proves even more devastating than physical corruption. Kroot who have consumed chaos-tainted flesh begin experiencing visions and compulsions that erode their sanity and connection to their kindred. They hear whispers promising power and evolution, beyond anything their shapers could achieve through conventional consumption. Some become convinced that their mutations represent the next stage of Kroot development, attempting to convince their kindred mates to join them in consuming more tainted flesh. Others descend into madness that manifests as paranoia, turning on their own warriors in fits of violence that can only be ended through death. The corruption spreads through the kindred like a plague, as those who have consumed tainted flesh produce offspring carrying the same corruption, creating cascading failure that can reduce a thriving bloodline to twisted abominations within 3 or 4 generations. Shapers who recognize chaos corruption in their kindred face impossible choices that test their commitment to their people's survival. The corrupted individuals are still kindred members, still connected through bloodlines that stretch back generations, yet allowing them to live risks spreading the corruption further, while consuming their flesh to prevent waste would only transfer the taint to those who fed. The only solution is complete destruction, burning the corrupted and their offspring to ensure no trace of tainted genetic material survives. Some shapers have chosen to consume their corrupted kindred themselves, believing they can resist the corruption through force of will, only to fall to the same madness they sought to prevent. The few kindreds that have survived chaos corruption outbreaks did so only through ruthless purges that eliminated entire bloodlines, accepting catastrophic losses to their genetic diversity rather than risk total annihilation. The prohibition against consuming chaos, tainted flesh operates as the most absolute and universal taboo in Kroot culture, enforced through both shaper authority and deep-seated instinctual revulsion that Kroot feel when exposed to the corrupted. Young warriors learn to recognize the signs of chaos taint from their earliest training, the unnatural colors that flesh takes on when warped by the immaterium, the wrongness that radiates from servants of the ruinous powers, the way their quills recoil when approaching tainted corpses. Shapers teach that no evolutionary advantage, no matter how tempting, justifies the risk of consuming anything touched by chaos. When Kroot forces encounter chaos cultists or demonic entities, standing orders require that all enemy dead be burned rather than consumed, with warriors who violate this prohibition facing immediate execution to prevent potential contamination from spreading. The relationship between Kroot and orcs represents a different kind of danger, one that balances valuable genetic material against significant risks of devolution and uncontrolled aggression. Orcs possess physical characteristics that many kindreds find appealing: enhanced musculature, remarkable regenerative capabilities, and innate toughness that allows them to survive injuries that would kill most other species. The genetic simplicity of orcs, being fungal-based organisms rather than conventional biological entities, means their traits can be incorporated into Kroot physiology with relative ease compared to more complex species. A kindred that regularly consumes orc flesh will produce offspring displaying increased physical strength and durability, traits that prove valuable in combat situations requiring brute force over finesse. However, orc consumption carries serious dangers that shapers must carefully manage. The aggressive nature that makes orcs formidable opponents transfers through consumption, potentially overwhelming the discipline and tactical sophistication that characterizes effective Kroot warriors. Kindreds that feed too heavily on orcs have produced generations that favor direct assault over ambush tactics, that struggle to follow complex battle plans, and that display reduced problem-solving capabilities compared to their ancestors. The regenerative properties that orcs possess can manifest in Kroot descendants as uncontrolled cellular growth, leading to tumors and deformities that reduce combat effectiveness rather than enhancing it. Most seriously, excessive orc consumption has been observed to reduce intelligence across generations, with heavily orc-influenced bloodlines producing warriors who retain physical prowess but lose the cognitive capabilities that separate Kroot from mere beasts. Shapers who authorize orc consumption do so under strict controls that limit both quantity and frequency. A typical protocol might allow warriors to consume orc flesh after particularly significant victories, with the shaper personally selecting which portions go to which warriors based on their bloodlines, current characteristics, and needs. Warriors from lines that have become too cerebral or physically weak might receive larger portions to introduce beneficial orcide traits, while those from more aggressive bloodlines might be restricted or forbidden entirely from orc consumption. The Shaper monitors subsequent generations carefully, watching for signs that orc traits are manifesting too strongly and adjusting dietary restrictions accordingly. Some kindreds maintain complete prohibitions against orc consumption, judging that the risks outweigh any potential benefits regardless of how carefully the process is managed. Combat operations against orcs test Kroot capabilities in ways that few other enemies can match. Orcs fight with savage enthusiasm and physical power that can overwhelm Kroot forces if they allow themselves to be drawn into prolonged melee exchanges. The orc ability to rapidly reproduce through spore propagation means that victories against them rarely prove decisive, as new orcs emerge from the corpses of the fallen to replace losses with disturbing speed. Kroot ambush tactics that work effectively against more disciplined enemies often fail against orcs, who charge toward the source of gunfire with enthusiasm rather than seeking cover. The chaotic nature of orc warfare disrupts the careful timing and coordination that Kroot battle plans require, forcing Shapers to adapt their tactics to account for enemies who cannot be predicted or manipulated through conventional means. Despite these challenges, Kroot forces have developed effective methods for engaging orcs that play to their advantages while minimizing exposure to orcide strengths. Hit-and-run attacks that inflict casualties before withdrawing prevent orcs from bringing their numbers and close combat prowess to bear. Targeting orc leaders disrupts their already tenuous organization, causing mobs to fragment into smaller groups that can be defeated in detail. Kroot Hounds prove particularly effective against orcs, as their speed and low profile allow them to avoid the wild swings of orc choppas, while their pack tactics let them bring down even large orcs through coordinated attacks. Krootox provide the heavy firepower necessary to eliminate orc vehicles and the largest specimens, while their bulk allows them to engage orcs in close combat without being immediately overwhelmed. The Tyrannid threat represents an entirely different category of danger, one that has fundamentally altered Kroot understanding of what should and should not be consumed. The first encounters between Kroot forces and Tyrannid organisms occurred during the early stages of various Hive fleet incursions, when Kroot mercenaries or Tau auxiliaries found themselves facing the alien horrors that the Hive fleets deploy. The initial response from some kindreds was to treat Tyrannid bioforms as they would any other prey, consuming fallen organisms in accordance with standard practice. The genetic material from Tyrannid creatures seemed to offer remarkable potential, as the organisms displayed specialized adaptations for specific combat roles and environmental conditions that exceeded what most species achieved through conventional evolution. The results of Tyrannid consumption proved catastrophic in ways that no Shaper anticipated. Warriors who consumed Tyrannid flesh began displaying mutations that bore no relationship to the traits they sought to incorporate. Their bodies twisted into configurations that served no purpose for Kroot combat doctrine or survival, instead reflecting the hive mind's influence reaching through consumed genetic material to corrupt and control. Some warriors developed carapace growths that restricted movement rather than providing protection. Others found their nervous systems altering in ways that made them responsive to psychic emanations from nearby Tyrannid organisms, effectively turning them into unwilling servants of the hive mind. The most disturbing cases involved warriors whose bodies began producing Tyrannid organisms from within, their flesh serving as incubators for creatures that eventually burst forth to attack their former kindred mates. The genetic corruption from Tyrannid consumption proved impossible to control or reverse through conventional Shaper methods. Unlike other forms of unwise consumption that could be corrected through dietary adjustments over subsequent generations, Tyrannid taint seemed to actively resist such efforts. Offspring of warriors who had consumed Tyrannid flesh displayed the same mutations and worse, with each generation showing increased deviation from baseline Kroot physiology. Some kindreds attempted to isolate affected bloodlines, hoping to study the corruption and develop countermeasures, only to watch as the isolated groups devolved into something that could no longer be recognized as Kroot. The creatures they became displayed Tyrannid characteristics, while retaining enough Kroot features to create abominations that served neither species effectively. The species' wide prohibition against consuming Tyrannid bioforms emerged rapidly once the scope of the threat became clear. Shaper councils convened specifically to address the Tyrannid consumption issue, with representatives from kindreds that had experienced the corruption firsthand describing the horrors they had witnessed. The decision to completely forbid Tyrannid consumption represented one of the few universal edicts that all Kroot kindreds accepted without debate, as the evidence of what happened to those who violated the prohibition proved too compelling to ignore. The prohibition extends beyond simple dietary restriction to include mandatory destruction of all Tyrannid biomass through fire, ensuring that no genetic material survives that might tempt desperate or foolish warriors to consume it despite the known dangers. Kroot forces that encounter Tyrannid organisms now fight with the understanding that no evolutionary benefit can be gained from victory, only survival. This fundamentally alters the risk-reward calculations that normally govern Kroot military operations, as battles against Tyrannids offer no compensation through consumption for casualties suffered. Some kindreds refuse contracts that involve Tyrannid threats entirely, judging that the danger outweighs any payment or other benefits employers might offer. Others accept such contracts only when serving the Tau Empire or when defending Pech itself, situations where kindred survival depends on defeating Tyrannid incursions regardless of the lack of evolutionary opportunities. The psychological impact of fighting enemies they cannot consume affects Kroot morale in subtle ways, as warriors accustomed to viewing fallen enemies as potential strength find themselves facing foes that represent only waste and corruption. Imperial persecution of Kroot populations manifests through multiple mechanisms, from localized purges to systematic campaigns aimed at eliminating their presence from entire sectors. The Inquisition views Kroot with particular suspicion due to their consumption of sentient beings and their service as Xenos mercenaries, characteristics that mark them as threats to imperial purity and potential vectors for corruption. Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos have authorized numerous operations against Kroot kindreds operating in imperial space, deploying everything from Deathwatch kill teams to full Imperial Guard regiments, depending on the perceived threat level and available resources. These purges typically target Kroot mercenary bands that have accepted contracts in Imperial territory, with inquisitorial forces tracking them down after their employers no longer require their services, or when their presence comes to inquisitorial attention through other means. The Damocles Crusade represented the most significant Imperial military action affecting Kroot populations, as the campaign targeted Tau expansion and therefore struck at Kroot forces serving as Tau auxiliaries. Imperial forces engaging Tau armies encountered Kroot auxiliaries in virtually every major engagement, learning to recognize their distinctive tactics and the threat they posed to Imperial infantry. Space Marines of various chapters participated in the crusade, with Astartes forces proving particularly effective at countering Kroot ambush tactics through their superior sensory equipment and combat experience. The casualties inflicted on Kroot populations during the crusade were substantial, with entire kindreds being wiped out in battles across multiple worlds as Imperial forces pushed toward Tau core territories. The experience of the Damocles Crusade taught both Imperial forces and Kroot valuable lessons about each other's capabilities. Imperial commanders learned that Kroot could not be dismissed as primitive Xenos auxiliaries, but represented serious threats that required proper tactical countermeasures. The effectiveness of massed firepower and armored vehicles against Kroot forces became standard doctrine, as did the importance of maintaining formation integrity to prevent Kroot from exploiting gaps for their devastating close combat charges. Kroot Shapers, for their part, gained hard-won knowledge about Imperial military capabilities and the particular threats posed by Space Marine forces, information that spread throughout the Kroot mercenary network and influenced how kindreds approached conflicts with Imperial forces in subsequent engagements. Space Marine chapters maintain varied attitudes toward Kroot, but most view them as Xeno's abominations, whose consumption practices mark them as particularly deserving of extermination. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters, having been heavily involved in the Damocles Crusade, possess extensive experience fighting Kroot and have developed specific tactical doctrines for countering their ambush-based warfare. These doctrines emphasize maintaining tight formation integrity, using auspex scans to detect hidden Kroot positions before they can spring ambushes, and employing flamers and other area effect weapons to clear terrain where Kroot might be concealed. Ultramarines descended chapters treat Kroot as worthy opponents in the sense that they require proper tactical consideration, but this respect for their combat capabilities does not translate into any mercy or consideration for Kroot as sentient beings deserving of anything but death. Other chapters view Kroot through different philosophical lenses while reaching similar conclusions about their ultimate fate. The Space Wolves, with their own practices that some might consider uncomfortably close to the Kroot consumption of fallen enemies, nonetheless condemn the Xenos as abominations whose existence offends the Emperor's vision for the galaxy. The Black Templars pursue Kroot with particular zeal when encountered, viewing their extermination as righteous work that serves the Emperor's will. The Blood Angels and their successors find Kroot consumption practices disturbingly reminiscent of their own chapter's curse, creating a visceral hatred that drives them to eliminate Kroot forces with extreme prejudice whenever the opportunity presents itself. Even chapters known for more pragmatic approaches to Xenos, such as the Raven Guard or the Salamanders, make no exceptions for Kroot despite their obvious intelligence and complex society. The few instances of cooperation between Space Marines and Kroot forces have occurred only under the most extreme circumstances, typically when both find themselves facing threats that override their mutual hostility. During certain Tyranid incursions, Imperial forces and Kroot mercenaries have found themselves defending the same worlds against the Hive fleets, leading to situations where both groups focus on the immediate existential threat while maintaining wary distance from each other. These temporary cessations of hostility rarely last beyond the immediate crisis, with Imperial forces often turning on their Kroot allies once the greater threat has been eliminated. Kroot shapers who have experienced such betrayals ensure their kindreds remember the lessons, reinforcing the understanding that cooperation with Imperial forces represents a desperate measure that should never be relied upon or trusted to continue beyond immediate necessity. The philosophical question of whether Kroot can be considered truly sentient by Imperial standards occasionally arises in inquisitorial debates, though these discussions typically conclude that their Xenos nature renders the question moot regardless of the answer. Some radical inquisitors argue that Kroot display clear evidence of intelligence, culture, and self-awareness that should qualify them for protected status under certain interpretations of the Emperor's teachings about humanity's relationship with alien species. Puritan factions counter that Kroot consumption practices and their mercenary service to enemies of the Imperium mark them as threats that must be eliminated regardless of their cognitive capabilities. The debate remains unresolved at any official level, leaving individual inquisitors to make their own determinations about how to handle Kroot encountered during their operations. The cumulative effect of these various threats creates an existence for Kroot that balances opportunity against constant danger. Their evolutionary advantages and combat capabilities provide access to battlefields across the galaxy and employment opportunities that sustain their kindreds. But these same characteristics mark them as targets for enemies ranging from chaos corruption to imperial persecution. Shapers must navigate this treacherous landscape while guiding their kindred's evolution, making decisions that account for immediate survival needs while pursuing long-term genetic goals. The lost kindreds that fell to chaos corruption, Tyranid taint, or imperial purges serve as constant reminders of what happens when vigilance fails, or when circumstances overwhelm even the wisest shaper's ability to protect their people. The survivors carry forward the accumulated knowledge of these disasters, learning from the mistakes of lost bloodlines, while knowing that similar fates await any kindred that fails to maintain the careful balance between evolutionary ambition and practical caution that survival in the 41st millennium demands. Kroot stands as the most influential shaper in modern Kroot history, the architect of the alliance with the Tau Empire that fundamentally altered his species' trajectory. His kindred controlled substantial territories on Pech when the Orc invasion threatened to overwhelm multiple settlements, and his decision to formally ally with Tau forces against the Greenskin menace demonstrated the strategic vision that distinguished him from his contemporaries. Where other shapers viewed the Tau as merely another potential employer or threat to be managed, Kroot recognized that permanent cooperation could provide opportunities for evolutionary advancement far exceeding what isolated mercenary work offered. His negotiations with Tau water caste diplomats established the framework that would govern Kroot integration into Tau military operations, balancing kindred autonomy against the coordination that effective cooperation required. The lineage Kroot established continues to exert significant influence over Kroot-Tau relations generations after his death. His descendants inherited not just his genetic material, but his philosophy regarding the benefits of stable alliance over constant mercenary wandering. Several of his direct bloodline descendants serve as primary intermediaries between major Kroot kindreds and Tau military commands, using their ancestors' reputation and the relationships he forged to facilitate cooperation when tensions arise. The kindred he led has become one of the most prominent within Tau's service, frequently requested for critical operations where Kroot capabilities prove essential. Other shapers studying the results of Kroot's choices note that his kindred has maintained remarkable evolutionary diversity despite generations of service to a single employer, suggesting that his careful management of consumption opportunities within the Tau Alliance framework achieved the balance between stability and advancement that many kindreds struggle to maintain. The specialized evolutionary branches that various kindreds have pursued demonstrate the remarkable flexibility of Kroot hyperadaptive physiology when guided by skilled shapers over multiple generations. Certain kindreds operating in the dense forests of Tau colony worlds have evolved enhanced arboreal capabilities through sustained consumption of tree-dwelling predators and careful dietary management. Their descendants display longer fingers with more pronounced claws for gripping bark, improved depth perception for navigating three-dimensional canopy environments, and increased flexibility in their spine and limbs that allows them to move through branches with fluid grace. These forest-specialized kindreds provide invaluable service in jungle warfare operations, where their adaptations give them advantages that even standard Kroot cannot match. Other kindreds have pursued adaptations for void combat operations, a challenging evolutionary path given that space represents an environment fundamentally hostile to biological life. The shapers guiding these kindreds cannot simply consume void-dwelling creatures to gain vacuum resistance, as such traits exceed what Kroot physiology can reasonably incorporate. Instead, they have focused on characteristics that enhance effectiveness in the confined spaces of spacecraft and orbital facilities where void combat typically occurs. Consumption of creatures with enhanced spatial awareness and the ability to operate in complete darkness has produced descendants with improved proprioception and sensory capabilities that function without visual input. These void-specialized kindreds excel at boarding actions and the defense of spacecraft, their adaptations allowing them to fight effectively in conditions where environmental factors that would disadvantage other forces become irrelevant. Desert-adapted kindreds operating on arid Tau colony worlds have incorporated traits from heat-resistant prey species, developing enhanced cooling mechanisms and the ability to conserve water with efficiency that allows extended operations in conditions that would quickly incapacitate standard Kroot forces. Their skin has evolved subtle changes in pigmentation and texture that provide better protection against intense solar radiation, while their respiratory systems process air more efficiently to minimize water loss through breathing. Some of these desert kindreds have also developed enhanced resistance to the toxic compounds that certain desert-dwelling prey use as defensive mechanisms, allowing them to consume a broader range of local fauna and accelerate their adaptation to harsh environments. The most extreme specializations have produced kindreds whose appearance and capabilities diverge significantly from baseline Kroot physiology, while remaining recognizably part of the same species. Certain kindreds serving in aquatic environments have developed webbing between their fingers and toes, enhanced lung capacity for extended breath holding, and eyes adapted for underwater vision. These aquatic specialists cannot match truly water-dwelling species in their native element, but they operate far more effectively in rivers, swamps, and coastal regions than standard Kroot could manage. The evolutionary path that produces such specializations requires generations of focused consumption and careful shaper management to ensure the adaptations enhance capability rather than creating vulnerabilities that outweigh their benefits. The tension inherent in pursuing specialized evolutionary paths lies in the risk of over-specialization that leaves kindreds unable to function effectively outside their optimized environment. A kindred that has adapted extensively for desert warfare may find itself at severe disadvantage if deployed to frozen worlds or humid jungle environments. Shapers must balance the benefits of specialization against the need to maintain versatility, ensuring their kindreds can still operate across diverse conditions even as they develop enhanced capabilities for specific situations. Some kindreds address this challenge by maintaining multiple bloodlines within their population, with different family groups pursuing complementary specializations that allow the kindred as a whole to deploy appropriate forces for various environments while avoiding the vulnerability that complete specialization would create. The Damocles Crusade represented the largest military engagement involving Kroot forces in recent history, as Imperial forces launched a massive campaign to halt Tau expansion and push back the young Empire's borders. Kroot auxiliaries participated in virtually every major battle of the Crusade, deployed by Tau commanders to secure objectives in terrain where fire warrior effectiveness declined, or to protect flanks against Imperial Guard infantry advances. The campaign exposed Kroot forces to the full spectrum of Imperial military capabilities, from massed Guard infantry assaults to Space Marine strike operations and mechanized armor columns that could devastate Kroot positions if they allowed themselves to become pinned in unfavorable terrain. The battles on Daleth Prime saw Kroot forces conducting extensive guerrilla operations against Imperial supply lines, using their ability to operate independently for extended periods to harass Guard logistics networks and eliminate isolated outposts. These operations inflicted casualties disproportionate to the Kroot numbers involved, as small carnivore squads ambushed supply convoys and disappeared into the wilderness before Imperial forces could respond effectively. However, when Imperial commanders adapted their tactics to include armored escorts and aerial reconnaissance, Kroot casualties increased dramatically as their ambush positions were detected and eliminated by artillery strikes or armored assaults that Kroot weapons could not effectively counter. The fighting in the urban ruins of several contested worlds demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Kroot forces in sustained combat operations. Kroot excelled at close quarters, fighting in the rubble-choked streets and damaged buildings, their agility allowing them to navigate terrain that slowed Imperial armor, while their close combat capabilities proved devastating against Guard infantry in confined spaces. However, the inability to consume Imperial dead due to Shaper prohibitions against feeding on human flesh meant that Kroot forces gained no evolutionary benefit from their victories, fighting purely for tactical objectives rather than the combination of military and genetic goals that typically motivated their operations. This psychological factor affected Kroot morale in subtle ways, as warriors accustomed to viewing battlefields as both combat zones and feeding grounds found themselves in extended campaigns where success brought no evolutionary rewards. The Tau Third Sphere expansion provided Kroot forces with opportunities to participate in conquests of new worlds, where the prey diversity offered significant evolutionary potential. Kroot kindreds deployed to newly discovered worlds encountered indigenous species that Tau forces had bypassed or ignored, providing access to genetic material unavailable through standard Tau military operations. Some kindreds negotiated permission to remain on conquered worlds after Tau forces moved on to new objectives, establishing semi-permanent settlements where they could systematically hunt and consume local fauna while providing garrison forces that secured Tau territorial claims. These arrangements benefited both species, giving Tau reliable security forces while allowing Kroot extended access to evolutionary opportunities that brief military campaigns could not provide. The Fourth Sphere expansion brought Kroot forces into contact with threats and environments that tested their capabilities in unprecedented ways. The mysterious circumstances surrounding the Fourth Sphere, Fleet's passage through the warp-created situations, where Kroot auxiliaries faced enemies and conditions that defied their accumulated experience. Some kindreds participating in the Fourth Sphere reported encounters with entities that their shapers could not categorize or assess for consumption safety, leading to conservative prohibitions against feeding on anything killed during certain operations. The psychological strain of fighting in conditions where the fundamental rules governing Kroot existence seemed suspended affected warriors, whose worldview centered on the cycle of consumption and evolution, creating morale challenges that shapers struggled to address through traditional methods. The opening of the Great Rift and the subsequent upheaval across the galaxy isolated numerous Kroot populations from both their homeworld and the broader network of war spheres that maintained species-wide cohesion. Kindreds operating in regions cut off by warp storms found themselves unable to communicate with other Kroot or access the established routes that war spheres traveled. These isolated populations faced existential decisions about how to proceed without guidance from master shapers or contact with other kindreds that might provide evolutionary insights and genetic diversity through controlled interbreeding. Some isolated kindreds have reportedly begun pursuing evolutionary paths that diverge significantly from accepted norms, their shapers making decisions based on limited information and desperate circumstances that may produce results ranging from remarkable adaptations to catastrophic degeneration. The impact of isolation on Kroot populations varies depending on their circumstances and the wisdom of their shapers. Kindreds trapped on worlds with limited prey diversity face the challenge of maintaining evolutionary momentum while avoiding overspecialization that could leave them vulnerable to environmental changes or new threats. Those isolated in regions with abundant but dangerous prey must balance the evolutionary opportunities against risks of consuming creatures whose traits might prove harmful without access to other kindreds' experiences with similar species. The most concerning reports suggest that some isolated kindreds have begun consuming prey that established protocols would prohibit, their desperate circumstances overriding caution that normally governs shaper decisions about dietary restrictions. The future of the Kroot species remains uncertain as the galaxy descends into unprecedented chaos following the Great Rift's opening. The alliance with the Tau Empire provides stability and resources that many kindreds value, but tensions within this relationship continue to grow as Tau expectations of loyalty and coordination sometimes conflict with Kroot traditions of autonomy and evolutionary priority. Some Tau commanders have expressed frustration with Kroot auxiliaries, who refuse orders or abandon positions when their shapers determine that the tactical situation offers insufficient evolutionary benefit to justify continued casualties. These incidents strain relationships built over generations of cooperation, raising questions about whether the alliance can survive if fundamental incompatibilities between Tau military doctrine and Kroot evolutionary imperatives cannot be reconciled. The search for evolutionary advancement drives all Kroot decisions, but the paths forward grow increasingly complex as the species encounters new threats and opportunities. Traditional prey species that provided reliable evolutionary benefits for generations may no longer be available in regions affected by the Great Rift's opening, forcing shapers to evaluate unfamiliar creatures without the accumulated knowledge that would normally guide their decisions. The temptation to consume powerful but dangerous prey grows stronger when kindreds face existential threats that conventional evolution cannot address quickly enough. Some shapers advocate for more aggressive evolutionary experimentation, arguing that the galaxy's current state demands rapid adaptation even at the cost of increased risk. Others counsel caution, warning that desperation-driven consumption decisions could produce the kind of catastrophic failures that destroyed the lost kindreds whose tales serve as warnings to the species. The threat of over-specialization looms larger as individual kindreds pursue increasingly divergent evolutionary paths in response to specific challenges or opportunities. A species that once maintained broad capability across diverse environments and combat situations risks fragmenting into specialized variants that excel in narrow circumstances while becoming vulnerable in others. The loss of contact between isolated kindreds accelerates this fragmentation as populations evolve along separate paths without the moderating influence of shaper councils that would normally coordinate development to maintain complementary rather than redundant specializations. If current trends continue, the Kroot species may eventually diverge into multiple distinct subspecies that can no longer interbreed or cooperate effectively, losing the unity that has sustained them through millennia of challenges. The eternal balance between adaptation and identity represents the fundamental challenge that defines Kroot existence. Every consumption decision, every evolutionary path pursued, every specialization developed moves the species further from their ancestral form, while theoretically enhancing their capabilities for current circumstances. Yet there exists no clear answer to the question of how much change Kroot can undergo before they cease to be recognizably Kroot, before the accumulated modifications transform them into something that has lost the essential characteristics that made their species successful. Shapers debate this question during their rare gatherings, seeking wisdom that might guide their individual decisions about how far to push evolutionary boundaries in pursuit of advancement. The consumption practices that define Kroot civilization also represent their greatest vulnerability, as the same mechanism that allows rapid adaptation creates vectors for corruption, degeneration, and loss of identity. Each meal carries potential for both evolutionary breakthrough and catastrophic failure, with the difference often invisible until subsequent generations reveal whether shaper wisdom guided the kindred toward advancement or disaster. The accumulated prohibitions against consuming chaos-tainted flesh, tyrannid bioforms, and certain other dangerous prey represent hard-won knowledge purchased through the destruction of kindreds that learned these lessons too late. Yet new threats continue to emerge, and shapers must make decisions about unfamiliar prey without the benefit of experience that would reveal whether consumption serves their kindred's interests or dooms their bloodlines. The Kroot face the 42nd millennium as a species caught between opportunity and existential threat, their unique capabilities providing access to evolutionary advancement that other species cannot match while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities that more static civilizations avoid. Their alliance with the Tau offers stability and resources, but constrains their independence and limits their evolutionary opportunities. Their mercenary traditions provide access to diverse battlefields and prey, but leave individual kindreds vulnerable to enemies that could overwhelm them without support from the broader species. The opening of the Great Rift has isolated populations and disrupted the networks that maintain species-wide cohesion, forcing kindreds to make critical decisions without the guidance and genetic diversity that contact with other Kroot would provide. Whether the Kroot will survive and prosper in the galaxy's current state depends on the wisdom of their shapers and the choices individual kindreds make about balancing immediate survival against long-term evolutionary goals. The species has endured for millennia through careful consumption and adaptive evolution, but the challenges they now face exceed anything their ancestors encountered. The lost kindred serve as warnings of what happens when wisdom fails, or when circumstances overwhelm even the best shaper guidance. The successful kindreds demonstrate that survival remains possible for those who maintain the balance between adaptation and identity, between pursuing evolutionary advancement and preserving the essential characteristics that define what it means to be Kroot. The future remains unwritten, shaped by decisions made in the present by shapers who carry the weight of their species' destiny in every consumption choice they authorize and every evolutionary path they pursue for their bloodlines.